The letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning in early spring, when the world outside the Ashford townhouse was just beginning to emerge from winter's grip, and when the financial crisis that had been consuming Thomas Ashford's business interests for months had finally reached the point of absolute inevitability. The letter bore the seal of the Duke of Ashcroft, a seal that carried with it the weight of centuries of aristocratic authority and the promise of what it represented to a man facing complete financial dissolution. Thomas Ashford had read the letter 3 times, had set it down on his mahogany desk, had picked it up again, and had finally walked to the window where he stood looking out at the London street below, with expression that suggested he was contemplating something far more significant than the ordinary commerce of the city. The letter was extraordinary in its directness. The Duke of Ashcroft was in need of wife. The Duke was aware that Thomas Ashford had daughter of appropriate age and appropriate breeding. The Duke was prepared to offer substantial financial settlement in exchange for the marriage. The Duke requested response within fortnight. There was nothing in the letter that acknowledged the particular desperation that must have prompted such proposal. There was nothing that suggested the Duke understood or cared about the circumstances that would make such marriage necessary from the perspective of the bride's family. It was transaction articulated with the cold precision of aristocratic authority. Yet it was transaction that would solve everything: the mounting debts, the threatened loss of property, the particular anxiety that had been consuming Thomas for months regarding what would become of his family should complete ruin arrive. He had summoned Rosalind to his study that same afternoon. She had arrived expecting something. Anxiety regarding her father's condition had become constant state, yet she had not anticipated what he was about to articulate. She had listened as he had explained with obvious difficulty what the letter from the Duke had proposed. She had sat in silence as he had explained why this marriage would be acceptable, why she should accept it, why this was salvation for her family that could not be refused. "You understand what I am asking," Thomas had said, and Rosalind had perceived in his voice the particular weight of a man asking his daughter to undertake sacrifice that would benefit everyone but herself. "You understand that without this alliance, our family faces ruin. You understand that marriage to a duke, however distant or however undertaken, offers you position and security that most women never achieve. You understand that this is what must occur." Rosalind had understood. Understanding had not made acceptance any less painful. She had spent the preceding years developing particular vision of what her life might become, vision that included marriage to man she cared for, marriage grounded in mutual affection, marriage that would be partnership rather than arrangement. The letter from the Duke represented termination of that vision. The letter represented acceptance of duty, acceptance of sacrifice, acceptance of future that would be secure, yet utterly devoid of the particular qualities that would make that security meaningful. "I will write to the Duke accepting his proposal," Thomas had continued, and Rosalind had recognized that the decision had already been made, that her acceptance was formality rather than genuine choice. "You will prepare to depart for the Duke's country estate within the month. You will be married at Ashcroft House, and you will become Duchess. This will secure the family's future and will offer you life of considerable privilege despite the particular circumstances of the arrangement." She had written the letter of acceptance herself, had undertaken the work of expressing in proper language her willingness to undertake marriage to a man she had never encountered, to whom she had been offered as solution to financial crisis, who viewed her as means to particular end rather than as person of value. The letter had been formal and appropriate. It had contained nothing of what she actually felt: the particular grief of abandoned dreams, the anxiety regarding what marriage to such man might actually entail, the overwhelming sense of loss accompanying the recognition that her life had been determined not by her own choices, but by her father's financial decisions. The response from the Duke had been equally direct. He would expect her arrival at Ashcroft House on the 23rd of April. The marriage would occur on the 25th. The ceremonies would be conducted with appropriate formality, befitting union of his position and her family's standing. He required nothing of her except that she arrive prepared to undertake duties that would be explained to her upon her arrival. The month between acceptance and departure had been characterized by frantic activity, dressmakers arriving to create the wedding gown and the appropriate wardrobe for Duchess, relatives calling to offer congratulations or to seek favor from connection to powerful Duke, her father's business associates suddenly treating him with new respect now that marriage was assured. Rosalind had moved through this period with particular quality of detachment, had participated in the necessary preparations while remaining somehow separate from what was being prepared, had felt herself becoming bride, abstract role rather than continuation of herself. It was her friend Arabella who had recognized the particular sorrow that had accompanied the preparations. During one of the final fittings for the wedding gown, Arabella had observed Rosalind from across the room and had approached her with expressions suggesting she was about to articulate something she had been contemplating for considerable time. "You are not happy," Arabella had stated simply, and Rosalind had appreciated the directness of observation and the absence of social pretense that characterized their friendship. "I do not expect you to be delighted. One is not delighted by marriage to stranger. But there is something beyond ordinary anxiety in your expression. There is something of loss." "I am grieving," Rosalind had replied, and the honesty of admission had seemed to rupture something within her, had permitted particular truth to emerge that she had been containing since her father had first articulated the Duke's proposal. "I am grieving for the life I imagined I might have. I am grieving for the particular future I believed might be possible. I am grieving for person I believed I might become. The Duke is respectable, and he is powerful, and he will provide security. But he is not the person I imagined would share my life. He is not partner I was hoping to find. He is obligation undertaken because my father required me to undertake it, and I am afraid, I am profoundly afraid, that the particular grief I am experiencing now is only the beginning of what awaits me." Arabella had embraced her then, had offered whatever comfort proximity and genuine care could provide, and had offered also particular wisdom that had remained with Rosalind across the days that had followed. "Perhaps," Arabella had said, "what you are grieving is what you believed would be, but perhaps what awaits is something different, something that you cannot yet imagine, because it exists only in the particular space that this marriage will create. Perhaps you should not abandon hope that something valuable might emerge from obligation." The suggestion had offered small comfort, yet had also offered particular framework for approaching what was coming. On the 23rd of April, Rosalind had departed London in her father's carriage, had travelled toward the country estate she had never seen, had travelled toward husband she had never encountered, had travelled toward future she had not chosen, yet was now bound to embrace. The carriage had travelled for 2 days through landscape that gradually transformed from urban London into increasingly rural countryside. Rosalind had spent much of the journey observing the passage of spring through windows, the particular green that emerged as one departed the city, the wildflowers beginning to establish themselves along roadways, the particular quality of light that suggested genuine warmth was finally establishing itself after winter's prolonged grip. Yet even as the landscape had become progressively more beautiful, her anxiety regarding what awaited at journey's conclusion had become correspondingly more intense. Ashcroft House had announced itself first through the particular quality of road that suddenly transformed from rural track into properly maintained avenue lined with ancient oak trees. The trees had created cathedral-like passage, their branches interlaced overhead, to form tunnel of shifting green light that seemed almost deliberately designed to render arrival ceremonial and portentous. Then, beyond the trees, the house itself had emerged. House so vast and so distinguished in its architecture that Rosalind had felt her breath catch involuntarily. Ashcroft was not merely large. Ashcroft was statement. Construction of pale stone that rose multiple stories, facade that demonstrated centuries of prosperity and power, windows that seemed to regard the arriving carriage with the particular judgment of structure that had witnessed generations pass through its doors. Gardens surrounded the property in careful calculation of beauty and authority. The drive curved before the entrance in manner designed to present arrivals to maximum effect. The carriage had drawn to halt before the principal entrance, and Rosalind had found herself in particular moment where she had needed to gather courage to exit the conveyance. She had observed servants emerging to attend to the carriage, had perceived the particular scrutiny with which they had examined her, this unknown woman who was arriving to become their duchess, and had recognized that from this moment forward she would be observed, evaluated, assessed by individuals whose opinions regarding her suitability for the role would carry weight. A woman had emerged from the house, woman of advanced years, bearing herself with particular authority that suggested she held position of considerable importance within household. This had been Mrs. Helen Whitmore, head housekeeper at Ashcroft for more than 30 years, and she had offered curtsy that was perfunctory rather than warm, that communicated respect for position rather than welcome for person. "Miss Ashford," Mrs. Whitmore had stated, her voice carrying particular quality of professional courtesy, "we have been expecting your arrival. The Duchess, the Dowager Duchess that is, requests that you be settled in your chambers before formal meeting. The Duke will receive you at dinner this evening. Refreshment will be brought to your rooms should you require it. Please follow me." The interior of Ashcroft had been as imposing as its exterior. Endless corridors of polished wood and formal portraits, vast staircases that seemed designed to intimidate as well as to function. Rooms whose dimensions suggested that ordinary household operations seemed somehow inadequate to their scale. Rosalind had followed Mrs. Whitmore through this maze of aristocratic magnificence, had felt herself becoming increasingly small and increasingly aware of the particular gulf between her own modest circumstances and the overwhelming grandeur into which she had been delivered. Her chambers had been positioned in what Mrs. Whitmore had identified as the Duchess's wing, chambers that occupied considerable portion of the house's eastern aspect. The sitting room had been decorated with elegant restraint in shades of pale blue and cream, with furniture that suggested comfort alongside formality. The bedroom had been equally spacious, with windows that offered views of gardens and grounds extending seemingly endlessly toward the horizon. A dressing room adjoining had been equipped with everything a woman of considerable means might require. It had all been perfectly appointed, perfectly maintained, perfectly cold. "Your trunks will be brought directly," Mrs. Whitmore had explained. "The Dowager Duchess will call upon you at 3 o'clock if you are recovered from your journey. His Grace dines at 8 o'clock. Dinner dress will be expected. Should you require anything, you may ring for assistance. We will attend to your needs with appropriate promptness." And then she had been gone, leaving Rosalind alone in chambers that were clearly designed to communicate wealth and position, yet somehow seemed to emphasize rather than ameliorate the particular loneliness of her situation. She had sat upon the edge of the bed, enormous bed draped in pale silk, designed for considerable significance in household operations, and had permitted herself particular moment of private grief. She had contemplated the vast distance between what she had known and what she had now become. She had considered that this space, however beautiful, was meant to contain her, to occupy her, to define the sphere within which her life would proceed. She had acknowledged that the man whose name she would bear, whose household she had now entered, whose life she would share, remained as distant and as unknown as he had been when she had accepted marriage to him through exchange of formal letters. There had been knock at door, gentle, suggesting consideration for the possibility that she might require time before receiving visitors. One of the younger housemaids had appeared, bearing fresh water and linens, and had offered assistance with unpacking and with preparation for the Dowager Duchess's expected visit. The girl, who had introduced herself as Ellen and who had possessed particular quality of genuine kindness despite her formal position, had undertaken the work of revealing the contents of Rosalind's trunks, had commented with appropriate admiration upon the quality of her dresses, had positioned herself as small point of warmth within the otherwise overwhelming coldness of the house. "If I may say, miss," Ellen had ventured, as she had been arranging clothing in the wardrobe, "His Grace is fair man. Hard, perhaps, but fair. The household runs smooth under his authority. You will do well here, I expect, if you understand how to manage him." "How does one manage a duke?" Rosalind had asked, and the question had emerged with particular quality of genuine anxiety rather than social pleasantry. Ellen had paused in her work, had seemed to contemplate how to respond, and had finally articulated with care, "I believe, miss, that he is man who values truth and who dislikes pretense. He is not unkind, but neither is he warm. He keeps himself at distance. But should one demonstrate genuine capability and genuine respect, he responds with equivalent regard. I would say, be yourself. Do not attempt to be what you believe he wishes. He will respect honesty far more than he will respect performance." It was uncertain whether Ellen's assessment was accurate or whether it was merely kind fiction designed to offer comfort to anxious bride. Yet it was assessment that Rosalind had held close as she had prepared herself for the meeting that evening, had dressed carefully in the pale green dinner gown that her dressmakers had prepared, had arranged her black hair with particular attention to dignity rather than elaborate ornament, had positioned herself to meet whatever awaited her with whatever grace she could muster. The Dowager Duchess had called at 3 o'clock with punctuality that suggested she regarded such matters with considerable importance. She had arrived unannounced, except for the gentle knock that Mrs. Whitmore had provided, and had entered Rosalind's sitting room. With bearing that communicated she regarded herself as authority in all matters pertaining to her son's household and her son's marriage. Lady Constance Wellington had been woman of evident quality, woman whose pale grey eyes had assessed Rosalind with particular intensity, suggesting she was evaluating whether the bride was adequate to the role she was undertaking. She had been dressed entirely in black, the perpetual mourning that she maintained for her late husband evident in the quality of her jewellery and in the severity of her wardrobe. Her silver hair had been arranged with absolute perfection, and her posture had communicated a lifetime of exercising authority without question or hesitation. "You are precisely what I was led to believe you would be," the Dowager Duchess had stated, and Rosalind had been uncertain whether this assessment was positive or was merely neutral observation. "Your father provided accurate description of your appearance and your basic accomplishments. I trust you understand what has been expected of you in accepting this marriage." "I understand that the marriage addresses my father's financial circumstances," Rosalind had replied, attempting to balance honesty with appropriate deference. "I understand that I am to undertake duties as Duchess of Ashcroft. I understand that the arrangement benefits my family considerably." "Indeed," Lady Constance had responded, and a particular quality of recognition had seemed to cross her expression, recognition that the bride was not foolish, that she understood the transaction she was undertaking, and perhaps, though Rosalind could not be entirely certain, appreciation for such understanding. "You will need to be aware that my son is not a man of great emotional warmth. He has not been for considerable time. Circumstances in his life have rendered him somewhat distant. This distance is not personal reflection upon you. It is simply particular quality of his nature, at this juncture of his existence." "Might I inquire what circumstances have produced such distance?" Rosalind had asked, and immediately regretted the question as representing presumption beyond her station. Yet Lady Constance had not responded with reproof. Instead, she had regarded Rosalind with particular quality of consideration, as if reassessing her understanding of who the bride might be. "That is not my history to share," the Dowager had stated finally. "That is my son's history, and should he choose to share it, he will do so in his own manner and in his own time. I will say only that distance serves purpose for him. You would be wise to accept that distance rather than to attempt to breach it precipitously. Trust develops slowly, if it develops at all. Do not expect immediate warmth. If you receive eventual regard, you should regard yourself as fortunate." The conversation had continued with matters of considerable practical importance: household management, the particular procedures that governed dinner and social engagement, the various responsibilities that the Duchess role would require her to undertake. Lady Constance had provided instruction with the particular quality of woman who understood that detailed explanation of expectations would prevent the necessity of later correction. At 7 o'clock, Mrs. Whitmore had come to escort Rosalind to the dining room. She had travelled through corridors illuminated by candlelight. Gaslight had been installed in various rooms, but the Duke, it seemed, preferred candles in the more formal areas, had felt her anxiety increasing with each step toward whatever awaited her. The dining room had been vast, its table capable of seating 20 individuals, yet this evening occupied only by place settings for 3, the Duke, the Dowager Duchess, and herself. And then he had entered. Marcus, Duke of Ashcroft, had presented himself with the particular quality of man entirely conscious of the impression his entrance created. He had been taller than she had anticipated, broader through the shoulders, carrying himself with bearing that communicated authority without his requiring to articulate it. But it was his eyes that had held her attention, eyes of remarkable emerald green that had surveyed the room with particular quality of assessment before settling upon her with intensity that had rendered her suddenly aware of every physical detail of her own appearance. "Miss Ashford," he had stated, his voice carrying remarkable depth and a particular quality of careful control, "I trust your journey was not excessively fatiguing. I regret that pressing matters required my attention and prevented my being present to receive you upon your arrival." "Your Grace," she had responded, managing curtsy that she hoped communicated appropriate respect. "The journey was accomplished without difficulty, and I have been made entirely welcome by your household. I am grateful for the consideration that has been shown." "Welcome," he had repeated, and she had perceived in his expression something that might have been recognition that welcome was perhaps not entirely accurate description of what he had arranged. "I am pleased you have settled comfortably." We will discuss arrangements for the wedding ceremony at greater length tomorrow. For this evening, I trust we may accomplish dinner with companionable conversation. Companionable conversation had proven to be precisely what had not occurred. The meal had proceeded with remarkable silence, punctuated by necessary social exchanges. The Duke had addressed her with courtesy that was unfailing and entirely formal. The Dowager Duchess had observed them both with particular intensity that suggested she was assessing how the two were managing in proximity. Rosalind had found herself occupying state of acute awareness, aware of the particular distance that seemed to exist between where she sat and where the Duke occupied his place at the head of the table, aware that despite the physical proximity of dining arrangement, they remained profoundly separate. Yet once, as the second course had been served, the Duke had looked at her directly, had met her eyes with his own emerald gaze, and something had seemed to pass between them, moment of recognition that neither was precisely comfortable with the arrangement, that both were undertaking obligation without particular choice, that some form of authenticity existed beneath the performance that social situation demanded. The moment had passed as quickly as it had arrived, yet it had suggested to Rosalind that beneath the distance existed perhaps a person who was capable of genuine understanding. The morning of April 25th had dawned with remarkable clarity, spring sunshine rendering the gardens of Ashcroft House extraordinarily beautiful, the world seeming to demonstrate particular approval for the union that was about to be formalized. Rosalind had woken before dawn, had found sleep impossible despite the exhaustion that traveling and the emotional intensity of the previous day should have produced, and had spent the hours before sunrise contemplating what the day would bring. Ellen had arrived with chocolate and with assistance in preparing for the wedding. The dress that the dressmakers had created had been extraordinarily beautiful, white silk overlaid with intricate lace, constructed with such skill that it seemed almost insubstantial, despite its considerable weight. The veil had been attached to elaborate arrangement of flowers and pearls that served as coronet, and the overall effect had been designed to communicate purity and eligibility rather than joy or enthusiasm. "You look beautiful, miss," Ellen had said, and the sincerity in the girl's voice had suggested she was offering genuine compliment rather than mere professional courtesy. "Truly beautiful. Anyone would be honored to marry you looking like that." The question of whether the Duke would be honored had remained unanswered, hovering in the back of Rosalind's mind as she had been transported to the church where the ceremony was to be conducted. The church had been small and aristocratic, church on the Ashcroft estates where generations of dukes had been married and christened and buried. The interior had been decorated with flowers and with the particular ceremony that such significant events demanded. Perhaps 200 persons had occupied the pews, representatives of various noble families, business associates of the Ashcroft name, and scattered among them her own family, her father, watching with expression that communicated relief more than joy. The Duke had been waiting at the altar, dressed in formal black evening wear appropriate for afternoon ceremony. He had been speaking in low tones with the vicar, had appeared entirely composed, had demonstrated no particular emotion regarding the marriage he was about to undertake. When he had observed her arrival, he had turned, had regarded her with the same evaluative expression that had characterized their previous interactions, and had extended his hand in manner that communicated readiness to proceed. The ceremony itself had proceeded with remarkable efficiency. The vicar had spoken the traditional words. Rosalind had responded with voice that she had hoped communicated appropriate solemnity. The Duke had offered his responses with precision that suggested he had undertaken such proceedings before. Indeed, she had suddenly recalled that he had been married previously, that this was not first marriage for him, that the particular distance in his demeanor perhaps reflected something of the experience of marriage itself. They had been pronounced Duke and Duchess, and the assembled company had erupted in appropriate applause. They had processed back through the church together, her hand positioned upon his arm, and she had been aware with acute intensity of the particular solidity of him, the particular quality of controlled power that seemed to characterize his physical presence. The wedding breakfast had been conducted at Ashcroft House, had involved considerable conversation and social performance, and had seemed to extend with remarkable length. By the time evening had arrived, Rosalind had been exhausted not merely by the events of the day, but by the considerable effort required to maintain appropriate composure and appropriate performance throughout. It had been Mrs. Whitmore who had come to escort her to the Duchess's chambers as the evening had progressed. "His Grace will attend you shortly," the housekeeper had stated, and the particular tone in which she had offered this information had suggested she understood precisely what the wedding night was expected to accomplish. Rosalind had been left in the Duchess's chamber, private room adjoining the bedroom, decorated in shades of pale blue and cream, with fire established in fireplace and candles illuminating the space with particular quality of intimate warmth. She had dismissed Ellen and had remained alone with her own anxiety, had contemplated what was about to occur, had attempted to prepare herself for the particular intimacy that duty demanded. The Duke had entered without announcement, had been dressed in formal evening wear that communicated he had attended additional obligations before appearing. He had closed the door behind himself, had surveyed the chamber with the particular assessment that seemed to characterize all his observations, and had regarded her with expression that seemed to involve genuine internal conflict. "I believe it is customary for me to speak to you regarding what is expected this evening," he had stated finally, and the particular formality of his language had suggested he found the topic profoundly uncomfortable. "I wish to be direct with you regarding what you should anticipate." "I understand what my duties as wife will entail," Rosalind had replied, attempting to communicate appropriate preparedness while concealing the particular anxiety that accompanied such understanding. "Do you?" he had asked, and there had been something in his expression that had suggested her answer was important to him. "Because I wish to speak with you regarding my expectations, which may exceed what you have been led to believe by conventional wisdom regarding marital obligation. I do not demand what society suggests that husbands demand. I do not require what women are frequently told to endure. I wish from you participation rather than mere submission. I wish from you honesty rather than pretense. I wish from you that you inform me should anything I undertake be unwelcome, or should you require me to cease. Can you offer such honesty to me?" The question had seemed almost to rupture something within her. The particular vulnerability contained in asking whether she would offer him truth had seemed to suggest that beneath his distance existed a person capable of genuine care regarding her well-being. She had found herself responding with equal honesty. "Yes, I can offer such honesty. I wish to understand you as well. I wish to know what I can expect. I wish to know whether the distance I perceive is permanent state, or whether it might eventually transform into something different." "I do not know," Marcus had replied, and the admission had seemed to cost him considerable effort. "I do not know whether I am capable of offering what you deserve. I know only that I will attempt to treat you with respect, and that I will expect the same from you in return. Beyond that, I cannot make promises. Can you accept such limitation?" "Yes," she had replied. "I can accept honesty regarding limitation far more readily than I can accept deception regarding promise." And so they had come together, not with passion that society suggested characterized wedding nights, but with particular quality of mutual respect and mutual vulnerability. He had been careful, and he had been attentive to her comfort. She had found that she could offer him touch, and that he responded to it with particular quality of hunger that suggested loneliness far deeper than she had anticipated. What had occurred between them had not been the typical fulfillment of marital duty, but rather had been particular kind of intimacy, grounded in mutual acknowledgement of shared uncertainty and shared fear. Afterward, as they had remained in proximity, she had felt him maintaining careful distance, had perceived that despite what had just occurred, he was positioning walls once again, was returning to the particular guardedness that characterized him, yet she had also recognized that something had shifted, that the complete absence of connection that had characterized their previous interactions had been penetrated, if only slightly, by the particular vulnerability that intimate proximity demanded. The morning following the wedding had arrived with remarkable ordinariness, and Rosalind had discovered that becoming Duchess was not transformation that manifested in single extraordinary moment, but rather was gradual process of integration into household operations and into the particular rhythms that governance of such vast estate demanded. Mrs. Whitmore had arrived with breakfast, and with particular expression suggesting she was assessing whether the bride was prepared to undertake duties that her new position created. "The household has been awaiting your direction regarding several matters," Mrs. Whitmore had explained as she had positioned the breakfast tray. "The menus for this week require approval. There are social calls that should be scheduled for the coming weeks. The Dowager Duchess has inquired whether you wish to undertake consultation regarding any household modifications. There are also correspondence matters that typically fall to the Duchess to attend to. His Grace has suggested that you should undertake these responsibilities according to your own judgment, subject to consultation with myself, should you require guidance regarding household procedures." Rosalind had found herself over the following days engaged in work that was considerably more demanding and considerably more interesting than she had anticipated. The management of household of Ashcroft's magnitude required attention to hundreds of details. Menus that balanced nutrition with economy and with appropriate ceremony, coordination with housekeeping and kitchen staff regarding maintenance and supplies, management of social obligations that the Duke's position seemed to create, correspondence with various family members and acquaintances regarding matters both trivial and significant. Yet what had perhaps most significantly occupied her attention during these first days as Duchess had been the particular observation of Marcus and the gradual recognition that the distance she perceived in him was not merely social formality or mere emotional limitation, but rather was something far more profound, was protective structure that he had constructed around wounds that ran extremely deep. He had maintained his ordinary patterns of life, had ridden out each morning to oversee estate operations, had spent considerable portions of day in the study, attending to correspondence and business matters, had appeared for dinner each evening with courtesy that was unfailing and entirely formal. Yet she had begun to observe the particular moments when his guard seemed to lower, moments when he thought himself unobserved, when expression that was typically carefully controlled seemed to relax into something that suggested exhaustion and sorrow far deeper than she had initially comprehended. On the evening of the third day following the wedding, she had encountered him in the library, room of considerable magnificence lined with thousands of volumes, illuminated by candlelight that cast dancing shadows across the space. He had been standing before the fireplace, regarding the flames with expression of profound abstraction that suggested he was lost in thought of considerable weight. She had positioned herself quietly in the doorway, not wishing to intrude, yet finding herself unable to simply depart. "You move with remarkable silence," he had stated, without turning from the fire, yet with tone that suggested he had perceived her presence from the moment she had entered. "I trust you are adapting to the household operations with acceptable progress, Mrs. Whitmore has been extraordinarily helpful," Rosalind had replied, entering the room more fully and positioning herself at some distance from him, respecting the particular space that he seemed to maintain around himself. "The household operations are considerably more complex than I had anticipated, but I believe I am beginning to comprehend the particular systems through which everything functions. You will become competent at such management with remarkable rapidity," he had stated, and there had been something in his tone that suggested he had observed capabilities in her that she herself had not yet fully recognized. "You possess intelligence, and you possess capacity for attention to detail. Both are essential for management of households such as this. Have you perhaps been disappointed in previous Duchess?" The question had emerged before Rosalind had entirely considered whether she should ask it, yet once articulated, it could not be withdrawn. He had turned then, had regarded her with expression that had suggested the question had struck something significant within him. "Yes," he had replied finally, with apparent difficulty. "Previous marriage was undertaken from obligation, not unlike our own." The Duchess possessed considerable capability and considerable dedication to her role. Yet she could never seem to comprehend that I required from her something beyond competent performance of duty. She could never seem to understand that I was reaching toward her as person, rather than regarding her merely as vehicle for fulfilling obligations. "What became of her?" Rosalind had asked, though she had somehow known before asking that the answer would involve loss. "She died," he had stated, and the brevity of the response had communicated the particular depth of what that death had meant to him. Childbirth. It was complication that should have been survivable, yet somehow proved not to be. She died, and our child died with her. I was left with understanding that I had married woman without ever truly knowing her, that I had reached toward her without ever actually connecting, that she had remained as distant from me in death as she had been in life. The particular weight of this confession had seemed to transform the space between them. Rosalind had moved closer, had positioned herself beside him before the fireplace, had remained present without attempting to offer comfort through words that seemed inadequate to the enormity of what he had shared. "I am not she," Rosalind had stated finally, her voice quiet in the candle-lit space. "I do not know what she was or what she might have become. I know only that I am here now, and that I am attempting to understand you. I know that you are capable of reaching toward me, and I will attempt to meet you in that reaching. I will attempt to ensure that whatever this marriage becomes, it is built upon something more authentic than mere duty. He had remained silent for extended moment, and she had perceived that he was contemplating what she had offered, contemplating whether such authenticity was actually possible for him. Then, with movement that had suggested considerable effort, he had reached out and had taken her hand, had held it with what seemed to be extraordinary care, and in that particular act of connection had communicated something that words would not have adequately conveyed, acknowledgement that perhaps despite all his protection and all his distance, there might exist possibility that he could be known and could offer knowing in return. The following weeks had unfolded with remarkable progression towards something that Rosalind could not yet fully articulate, yet could certainly perceive in the subtle transformations that had begun to characterize the household dynamics. Marcus had continued his patterns of morning rides and afternoon business, yet something had shifted in his manner toward her, something that existed in the spaces between words, in the particular duration of glances, in the subtle ways his attention seemed to remain upon her during evening meals. It had been mid-April when the evening had arrived that had seemed to invite genuine conversation rather than mere social courtesy. Rosalind had been reading in the library, volume of poetry that had been suggested by Ellen, who had developed particular talent for understanding what might engage her new Duchess's interests, when Marcus had entered with expressions suggesting he had been searching for her. He had positioned himself in the chair adjacent to her, had observed the book she was reading, and had made comment regarding the particular selection. "Have you read Keats?" he had observed, and there had been something in his tone suggesting this fact possessed significance. "Do you appreciate poetry, or do you read from sense of obligation regarding what Duchess should undertake?" "I read because certain words seemed to articulate emotions that I could not otherwise express," Rosalind had replied, lowering the volume to regard him directly. "I read because the world seems less lonely when someone else has felt what I am feeling and has attempted to shape it into language. I read because—" She had paused, considering whether to articulate the remainder of her thought. "I read because you seem to live surrounded by people yet remain profoundly alone, and poetry suggests that this particular loneliness is not singular to myself." He had remained silent for extended moment, had seemed to contemplate her response with the particular intensity that suggested she had articulated something significant. "Keats died at 24, he had stated finally. "Death from tuberculosis. Knowing his brilliance would not be recognized until after his death. Yet he wrote, how did he express it? I have nothing to say but that I can die. There is particular courage in such articulation, is there not? Particular acceptance of mortality, coupled with determination to create meaning despite inevitable ending. Have you experienced such mortality awareness?" Rosalind had asked, and she had perceived immediately that the question had struck something profound within him. "Yes," he had replied, and the brevity of his response had communicated the depth of what that awareness represented. "When my first wife was dying, when I perceived that childbirth was progressing toward tragedy, I became aware that I was inhabiting a world in which death could arrive without warning, that those we believed we had endless time to know could be removed in moments, that I had been operating from assumption of infinite future when in fact future was entirely uncertain. That awareness, that particular terror regarding how quickly everything can be lost, it has remained with me continuously since. It is why I maintain distance. It is why I cannot permit myself to become emotionally dependent upon anything or anyone. Distance provides protection against the particular agony of loss." Rosalind had set down her book, had moved from her chair and positioned herself closer to him, had undertaken the remarkable act of reaching out and taking his hand with the particular gentleness that his confession seemed to demand. "Distance," she had stated quietly, "provides protection that is imperfect. You have experienced loss and yet you continue to exist. You have experienced the particular terror that you articulate and yet you remain. What if loss is not the thing to be feared, but rather is the inevitable companion to love, and what is to be feared is the alternative? What if the particular courage that Keats demonstrated was not acceptance of mortality, but willingness to create meaning despite mortality? What if you have been protecting yourself from loss at the expense of the connection that would make loss meaningful?" He had not responded immediately, had remained holding her hand, had seemed to be contemplating what she had articulated with the particular intensity that suggested it was addressing something he had been avoiding for considerable time. "If I were to permit such connection," he had stated finally, with evident difficulty, And if such connection were then to be severed through circumstances beyond my control, I do not believe I would possess the resilience to survive it. I do not believe I could bear such loss again. Perhaps, Rosalind had replied, you underestimate the particular resilience you have already demonstrated. You survived your wife's death. You survived the loss of your child. You continued to operate this household, to undertake your duties, to exist in the world despite such devastation. You are stronger than you believe, and your capacity to love, once you permit yourself to offer it, is likely far deeper than you comprehend. This conversation had seemed to mark a particular turning point. In the evenings that had followed, Marcus had begun to seek her out with increasing frequency. He had begun to share conversations that moved beyond the merely social, had begun to articulate observations regarding estate operations and regarding his own thoughts and reflections. He had begun, in small increments, to permit her access to the person who existed beneath the protective distance. It had been during one such evening, late April, with the spring now fully established and gardens at Ashcroft possessing the particular beauty of early bloom, that he had taken her hand as they had stood together on the terrace overlooking the grounds. "I am attempting something that terrifies me," he had articulated, his voice carrying particular quality of vulnerability. "I am attempting to believe that connection might be possible, that presence might be sustainable, that I might be capable of offering you not merely the structure of marriage, but something that approximates genuine partnership. I am uncertain of my capacity to undertake such vulnerability, yet I find myself increasingly unable to maintain the distance that has been my protection. Then perhaps," Rosalind had suggested, "we might undertake this terror together. Perhaps I might offer you the same willingness to be present that you are attempting to offer to me. Perhaps we might discover that shared vulnerability is more sustainable than individual protection." He had released her hand only to draw her into his arms, not with the careful distance that had characterized previous physical proximity, but with the particular intensity that suggested he was permitting himself to genuinely hold her, to permit her weight against his own, to accept the reality of her presence in his life with something approaching genuine acceptance rather than mere obligation. It had been in that moment, standing together on the terrace as evening had descended around them, and as the gardens had gradually surrendered to darkness, that Rosalind had recognized that something fundamental had shifted between them, that the marriage was beginning its transformation from transaction into something that possessed potential to become genuine partnership, grounded in mutual recognition and mutual reaching toward one another. The transition to London had occurred in early May, as custom demanded that the Duke undertake his responsibilities to his position by appearing at various social obligations during the height of the season. The townhouse on Belgrave Square had been prepared for their arrival, and Rosalind had found herself embarking upon the particular bewilderment of understanding that her role as Duchess extended far beyond the management of household operations, extended into the complicated sphere of social navigation, where reputation was currency and where a single miscalculation could result in significant consequences. The Dowager Duchess had remained at Ashcroft, having indicated that the London season represented a young Duchess's sphere of operation, yet she had not neglected to offer particular guidance regarding the various social conventions that would govern Rosalind's conduct. Lady Constance had been remarkably specific regarding which social engagements possessed significance and which could be regarded with relative indifference, had offered instruction regarding the particular individuals who wielded influence and whose approval or disapproval would impact the Duke's standing, and had impressed upon Rosalind that her conduct would reflect directly upon Marcus's reputation and position. The first formal ball had occurred in the second week of May, had been hosted by the Earl of Somerset at his London residence, and had involved hundreds of attendees representing the most significant families of aristocratic society. Rosalind had been dressed in exquisite pale green silk gown created by the most sought-after dressmaker in London, had worn jewels that had belonged to previous duchesses, and had been transported to the event in the Duke's carriage, with Marcus occupying the seat opposite her and regarding her with expression of careful assessment. "You are prepared for this," he had stated, and it had not been question, but rather affirmation of fact. "You possess the intelligence to navigate these particular social complexities and the dignity to undertake such navigation without requiring to perform false comportment. Yet I should warn you that not all will welcome you. There are individuals who possess particular expectations regarding the Duke's second marriage, and they may regard you with something less than enthusiasm." "Such as whom?" Rosalind had asked, attempting to calculate in advance what challenges might present themselves. "My cousin James," Marcus had replied, and there had been particular quality of tension that had accompanied mention of the name. He had believed, prior to our marriage, that circumstances might result in the dukedom passing eventually to his own line. Our marriage has complicated such calculations. He will regard you with suspicion and with assessment regarding whether you are likely to produce heir. There are also several women with whom I possessed prior connections, who may regard your presence as personally insulting. I apologize that you must navigate such complexity. Unfortunately, the obligations of my position require that I expose you to such circumstances. The ball itself had been extraordinary in its magnificence and in its particular quality of performance. The assembly rooms had been decorated with flowers and with crystal chandeliers that had rendered the space almost ethereal in its beauty. Musicians had occupied gallery and had provided continuous music that had accompanied the various social activities. There had been elaborate refreshments, there had been constant circulation of nobility and gentry, and there had existed the particular requirement that all participants engage in complex dance of social interaction where genuine emotion was masked behind careful courtesy. James Rothschild had made himself evident almost immediately, had approached them within the first hour with particular smile that had not reached his eyes, had offered congratulations on the marriage with tone that had communicated the reverse of good wishes, and had proceeded to articulate various comments regarding the speed of the marriage and regarding certain speculations regarding whether the union would accomplish what he seemed to suggest was its particular purpose. "I trust," James had stated, his voice carrying particular quality of calculated insult, "that the Duke has adequately explained his particular position regarding the necessity of producing heir. I understand that dukedom cannot continue indefinitely without appropriate successor. It would be tragic should such successor fail to materialize." Rosalind had recognized immediately that James was articulating doubt regarding whether she would produce children, was articulating suggestion that she might be incapable of fulfilling what he seemed to regard as her primary function. She had found herself responding with careful control. "The Duke and I have undertaken our marriage with understanding of the various obligations that such union entails. We are hopeful that the coming years will bring blessing of children. However, we are also cognizant that such matters rest with providence rather than with human will or intention." Marcus had placed his hand upon her back in manner that had communicated support and recognition of her response. When James had eventually withdrawn from the conversation, Marcus had leaned close and had articulated, his voice barely audible, "That was perfectly executed. You have offered response that was simultaneously dignified, mysterious, and that communicated absolute refusal to permit his insinuation to provoke defensive response. Such composure will serve you well throughout the season." The remainder of the evening had proceeded with Rosalind gradually becoming more confident in her role. She had engaged in conversations regarding art and literature, had danced with various gentlemen of significance, had undertaken the particular work of being perceived as appropriate duchess by those whose opinions carried weight. Yet she had been conscious throughout of Marcus's observation, had perceived that he was watching her, that he was assessing her conduct, and that his observation seemed to contain something that approximated approval. As they had returned to the townhouse in the early hours of morning, Marcus had offered his assessment. "You have acquitted yourself admirably. You have demonstrated capability and dignity. More significantly, you have demonstrated that you will not be intimidated by those who might regard you with suspicion. Such demonstration is important for establishing your position in society." "I was aware that you were observing me," Rosalind had acknowledged. "I was conscious of your presence and of your assessment. It seems that I perform better when I am conscious that I am being genuinely observed by someone whose opinion matters to me." "Is my opinion important to you?" Marcus had asked, and there had been something in his tone suggesting that her response mattered considerably. "Yes," she had replied simply, "your opinion is very important to me. What you believe regarding my capabilities, regarding my suitability for this role, regarding my value as your duchess, all of this matters to me in manner that I cannot fully articulate, but that seems to extend far beyond the mere social necessity of appearing well to my husband." He had drawn her into his arms then, had kissed her with intensity that had communicated something beyond mere physical attraction, something that had suggested he was permitting his emotional barriers to lower further, and something that had indicated his own opinion regarding her, had transformed considerably from the cold assessment that had characterized the early weeks of their marriage. June had arrived with extraordinary weather, summer heat that rendered the London townhouse increasingly uncomfortable, and that had prompted Marcus to suggest that they undertake departure to the country before the particular discomfort of midsummer in the city became untenable. Yet before their departure, there had occurred a series of private moments that had seemed to fundamentally alter the tenor of their marriage and that had transformed the particular connection that had been developing between them into something that possessed depth and authenticity previously absent. It had been during a private dinner in the townhouse, one of the rare evenings when Marcus had not undertaken social obligations, when they had been able to remain together without the necessity of maintaining the particular performance that public appearance demanded, that the conversation had occurred that had shifted the trajectory of their relationship. They had dined simply, had undertaken the luxury of removing themselves from the formal dining room, and had taken their meal instead in the small drawing room that overlooked the gardens of Belgrave Square. The evening had been warm, windows had been opened to permit circulation of air, and the particular quality of light that existed at that hour had rendered the space intimate and conducive to genuine conversation rather than mere social exchange. "I have been contemplating something," Rosalind had stated, as they had finished the main course and as servants had been clearing the table, "and I wish to ask you regarding it, yet I am uncertain whether such question might be regarded as inappropriate or presumptuous." "You may ask me anything," Marcus had replied, and the particular certainty with which he had articulated this had suggested that he genuinely meant such assertion. "I have become increasingly aware that our marriage has suffered significantly from assumptions and from absence of genuine communication. I wish that you undertake such communication freely. I have been aware," Rosalind had continued, "that you frequently experience what appears to be particular distress, moments when you seem to be recalled forcibly to some internal experience of pain or fear. These moments seem to involve your previous marriage and the particular loss that you experienced. Yet, I have been uncertain whether it is appropriate for me to inquire regarding these moments, or whether such inquiry would be regarded by you as intrusive." He had remained silent for an extended moment, and she had perceived that she had articulated something significant, something that he had perhaps been avoiding articulation himself. "The distress that you observe," he had stated finally, "is not distress that you have caused, nor is it distress that your inquiry would deepen. Rather, it is distress that has existed continuously since the death of my previous wife and the loss of our child. I experience moments, frequently triggered by particular sensory experiences or by memories, in which I am returned forcibly to the experience of standing in the bedchamber as she was dying, of understanding that I was about to lose both her and our child, of recognizing that I had never truly known her, had never truly reached her in manner that would permit us to have shared genuine connection. The particular agony that accompanied this recognition was that I understood only when it was too late that I had been constructing walls between us out of fear of precisely the loss that was then occurring." Rosalind had moved from her chair, had positioned herself beside his seat, and had taken his hand with the particular care that such admission seemed to demand. "You were protecting yourself," she had articulated gently. "You were attempting to prevent pain by preventing connection. Yet the pain came regardless, and the absence of connection rendered that pain far more devastating than it might have been had you permitted yourself to be vulnerable with her. Is that correct?" "Yes," he had replied, and the admission had seemed to rupture something within him, had seemed to permit tears to emerge, that he had been restraining for months or perhaps for years. "Yes, and I have spent every day since her death attempting to ensure that such pain would never again find me, understanding all the while that my attempt to prevent loss was simultaneously preventing any possibility of genuine life or genuine connection." Rosalind had remained beside him, had offered the particular comfort of her presence without attempting to articulate words that would be inadequate to the enormity of what he was experiencing. After an extended moment he had drawn her into his arms, not with the careful distance that had previously characterized their physical connection, but with genuine desperation that suggested he was permitting himself to truly hold her and to permit her to hold him in return. "I am terrified," he had articulated against her hair, his voice muffled and raw with emotion. "I am terrified that I am repeating the same patterns, that I will lose you as I lost her, that the particular walls I have constructed will prevent me from truly knowing you and will prevent you from truly knowing me. Yet simultaneously, I am aware that continuing to maintain such walls would guarantee the exact outcome I am attempting to prevent, would guarantee that even if I do not lose you, I would be living my life in isolation from the one person who offers possibility of genuine connection. Then perhaps, Rosalind had suggested, the alternative to walls is not absence of protection, but rather is trust. Perhaps protection might be found not in distance but in presence, in the knowledge that you are not alone in whatever may come, that whatever loss or difficulty emerges, you would be facing it not in isolation, but in partnership. I do not know what the future will bring. I do not know whether we will be spared from loss, or whether loss will find us regardless. I know only that I wish to face whatever comes with you, and that I wish for you to permit me that opportunity. What had followed that evening had been different from previous occasions of physical intimacy. What had occurred between them had involved not merely the particular tenderness that had characterized their previous encounters, but rather had involved genuine vulnerability and genuine mutual reaching toward one another. They had engaged in intimate relations that had seemed to communicate something beyond physical attraction, had seemed to articulate through the language of bodies what words could not adequately express, that they were choosing one another not from obligation or from fear, but from recognition that connection with one another was essential to their becoming fully alive. Afterward, as they had remained in proximity in the darkness of their chamber, Marcus had articulated something that had seemed to represent recognition of fundamental shift. I am no longer afraid of loving you. What I am now afraid of is whether you might perceive that such love is inadequate to what you deserve, whether you might ultimately recognize that I am not capable of offering you the wholehearted devotion that would constitute genuine partnership. That is fear I share, Rosalind had replied, her voice quiet in the darkness. Fear that I might not be adequate to what you require. Fear that I might fail you in manner that reproduces the pain you have already experienced. Yet I believe that such shared fear is perhaps better foundation for partnership than would be false certainty. We are both attempting to love despite our awareness of the particular ways that love renders us vulnerable. Such attempt, undertaken consciously and together, seems to me to constitute the most genuine form of courage. The return to Ashcroft House in early July had been undertaken with the particular knowledge that something had fundamentally transformed between them, yet with the simultaneous awareness that such transformation was fragile and that the particular pressures of reality might test it in unexpected ways. Marcus had seemed increasingly concerned about estate operations that had developed complications in his absence. There had been particular concerns regarding agricultural productivity and regarding certain financial obligations that required his immediate attention. Rosalind had found herself, within days of their return to the country, watching her husband gradually retreat once more into the particular distance that had begun to characterize his engagement with the world when he became preoccupied with matters he regarded as significant. He would retire to his study for hours at a time, would emerge with expressions suggesting he had been wrestling with problems that defied simple solutions, and would undertake the particular work of attempting to shield her from the particular worries that seemed to be consuming him. It had been mid-July when the letter had arrived from Dr. Mercer, the family physician, requesting that he be permitted to call upon the Duke regarding matter of considerable importance. The particular gravity with which the request had been articulated had suggested to Rosalind that something significant was occurring, something that Marcus had perhaps been aware of, yet had not articulated to her. She had observed the conversation between Marcus and Dr. Mercer only from a distance, had perceived through the open study door that serious discussion was occurring, and had recognized from Marcus's expression when the physician had departed that news had been delivered that was causing him considerable concern. Yet when she had inquired regarding the nature of the conversation, he had deflected her questions with assertions that the matter was merely regarding estate management and regarding certain health concerns regarding elderly tenants for whom the Duke took particular responsibility. "You are not being truthful with me," Rosalind had stated bluntly, several hours later, as they had been preparing for bed. "Something is troubling you profoundly. Dr. Mercer's visit was not casual, and your demeanor since his departure suggests you are experiencing particular distress. I have asked you to offer me honesty, and I believe I have demonstrated through my own actions that I am capable of receiving difficult truths without judgment or panic. Yet you are maintaining distance once more. You are returning to patterns of protecting yourself through concealment." He had regarded her in silence for an extended moment, and she had perceived that he was contemplating whether to maintain the protective barriers he had begun to lower, or whether to trust her with whatever knowledge he was carrying. "I am ill," he had stated finally, and the particular brevity of the articulation had communicated the considerable difficulty he was experiencing in offering such admission. "Not dying imminently, as far as Dr. Mercer can determine, but suffering from condition that will likely progressively worsen over the coming years. It is hereditary condition that affected my father and his father before him. It involves gradual weakening of constitution and eventual impact upon organ function. Dr. Mercer estimates that I have perhaps 10 to 15 years before the condition becomes truly debilitating, perhaps longer, if I am fortunate, and if the progression is slower than typical." The particular shock of this revelation had rendered Rosalind momentarily incapable of response. She had found herself contemplating the particular irony that she had committed herself to husband who was facing his own mortality, that she had undertaken marriage hoping to create genuine partnership, and that such partnership seemed to be bounded by particular temporal limitation. "How long have you known this?" she had asked finally. "I have suspected for some time," Marcus had replied. "I was aware when my father was dying of similar condition. I was aware when I married my first wife that I was likely not going to live long life. It is partially why I maintained such distance from her, why I could not permit myself to genuinely connect with her. The particular cruelty of the situation is that I was protecting myself from loss of another person, when in fact I was the one who was ultimately going to abandon her through my own declining health." "But you do not know that you will die," Rosalind had articulated. "You do not know that the condition will progress at the rate that your father's progressed. You do not know how much time you have, and therefore you do not know that you are inevitably going to abandon anyone." "Which is precisely why I have returned to attempting to maintain distance," Marcus had replied, and the particular honesty of the articulation had suggested he was aware of his own defensive patterns. "If I do not permit myself to depend upon you, if I do not permit you to depend upon me, then perhaps when the particular deterioration occurs, it will cause less pain. That is precisely the pattern that caused you such agony regarding your previous wife," Rosalind had stated with intensity that had surprised herself. "You are attempting to prevent loss by preventing connection. You are attempting to protect me by abandoning me before circumstance abandons you. You are choosing isolation as a form of protection, when in fact isolation is the worst possible response to the particular circumstances you are facing. If you are indeed going to experience progressive illness, then what you require is not distance, but rather is presence, is someone who will remain committed to you not despite your declining health, but because such commitment is essential to facing such decline with dignity and with grace." He had moved toward her then, had drawn her into his arms with particular intensity that had suggested he was recognizing the particular truth she was articulating, that attempting to prevent loss through distance would not prevent loss, but would guarantee it, and that the only genuine protection against the devastation of loss was to create connection so genuine and so authentic that it would sustain them both regardless of what the future might bring. "I do not deserve you," he had stated, his voice raw with emotion. "I do not deserve someone who is willing to commit to partnership with man, whose future is fundamentally uncertain, whose trajectory is inevitably downward, whose presence in your life is inevitably temporary." "That is life," Rosalind had replied. "All life is temporary. All of us are ultimately mortal. What distinguishes meaningful life from merely existing is the particular quality of connection that we undertake, despite our awareness of inevitable ending. I am choosing you precisely because I am aware that our time together is finite, and therefore I am choosing to ensure that such time is spent in genuine partnership rather than in protective distance. That is what love is. That is what genuine commitment means." The knowledge of Marcus's condition had not transformed their marriage in the manner that he had feared, had not prompted Rosalind to attempt to distance herself or to undertake premature grieving regarding the inevitable ending that was implied by such knowledge. Rather, the knowledge seemed to have catalyzed particular shift in both of them, seemed to have rendered explicit the particular reality that all partnerships are bounded by mortality, and that authentic partnership involves conscious choice to commit despite such limitation. The month of August had unfolded with particular quality of intensity and of deliberate presence. Marcus and Rosalind had begun to undertake the work of ensuring that their marriage would be grounded not in obligation or in fear, but rather in conscious commitment to creating meaning within the time that was available to them. They had developed particular patterns, had undertaken morning rides together through the grounds of Ashcroft, had spent afternoons in the library reading to one another, had undertaken the work of genuine conversation regarding their fears and their hopes and their dreams for what their partnership might accomplish. It had been during one such afternoon, late August, with the particular quality of light that suggested summer was beginning its transition toward autumn, that Rosalind had raised the question that had been occupying her thoughts for considerable time. Do you believe that you would be capable of creating heir? Despite your condition, despite your concerns regarding the future, would such creation be possible? Marcus had regarded her with particular intensity, and she had perceived that he was contemplating not merely the question of biological capability, but rather the larger question of whether he was willing to risk creating child, knowing that his declining health might render him absent for considerable portions of that child's life. I believe such creation would be possible, he had replied finally, and I find that despite my previous certainty that I would not undertake such risk, I am now contemplating it with increasing seriousness. The particular knowledge that my time is limited has rendered me aware that what matters is not avoiding loss, but rather is creating something of value before loss inevitably arrives. A child would be such creation, would be something that would extend beyond my own mortality, that would represent continuation of what we have built together, that would offer possibility that something of what we create would persist after I am gone. I would wish for such child, Rosalind had stated, and she had perceived that she was articulating truth that had been emerging gradually throughout the preceding weeks. I would wish to create life with you. I would wish to undertake motherhood alongside the partnership that we are building. I would wish to ensure that whatever time we have is utilized not in protective distance, but in conscious creation of meaning and connection and family. He had drawn her close then, had held her with particular care that had suggested he was permitting the particular hope that such undertaking represented to genuinely establish itself within him. I am no longer afraid, he had articulated, and she had recognized that this statement represented fundamental shift in his being. I am still aware of the particular risks and the particular pain that may come. I am still conscious that my time is limited, and that this limitation may bring particular sorrow. Yet I am no longer permitting such awareness to prevent me from truly living, truly connecting, truly creating. I am choosing you. I am choosing partnership. I am choosing to believe that whatever comes, we will face it together, and that such togetherness will render us capable of bearing what comes with dignity and with grace. What had followed that evening had been different from previous occasions of physical intimacy. What had transpired between them had seemed to constitute deliberate undertaking of particular promise, had seemed to articulate through the language of their bodies what words could not adequately express, that they were consciously creating foundation for what might emerge from their partnership, that they were choosing to believe in future despite awareness of limitation, that they were permitting love to transform them both in ways that neither had anticipated when they had stood before the vicar and had undertaken vows that they had not initially truly meant. In the weeks that had followed, Rosalind had found herself conscious of particular shift in her own internal experience. She had begun to recognize that she was no longer grieving for the life that she had imagined might have been possible, was no longer mourning the particular future that had been abandoned when she had accepted marriage to the Duke of Ashcroft. Rather, she had begun to recognize that what was emerging from her marriage was something far more valuable than what she had previously imagined, was something that offered genuine partnership, grounded in mutual vulnerability and mutual commitment to creating meaning within inevitable limitation. Marcus had similarly seemed to experience particular transformation. The particular distance that had characterized him at the beginning of their marriage had seemed to dissolve gradually, had been replaced by increasing willingness to be present, to be known, to risk vulnerability in pursuit of genuine connection. The particular grief regarding his previous marriage and the particular fear regarding inevitable loss seemed to have transformed into something different, not absence of sorrow or absence of fear, but rather integration of such emotions into larger framework of meaning and purpose and commitment to creating value despite such limitation. By the end of August, as summer had begun its gradual transition toward autumn, and as the gardens of Ashcroft House had begun to demonstrate the particular changes that indicated shifting season, something fundamental had shifted between them. The marriage that had begun as transaction had become genuine partnership. The distance that had protected them both from risk had been replaced by conscious vulnerability. The future that had seemed marked by inevitable loss had been transformed into something that possessed potential for profound meaning and authentic connection. It was in this space of genuine partnership and mutual commitment and conscious choosing of one another, that their story had reached its genuine turning point, and where the foundation had been established for what would emerge in the months and years to come. The arrival of September had brought with it the particular quality of change that characterized the transition between seasons, had brought cooler mornings and evenings that required the opening of fireplaces once more, had brought the particular color to the gardens that suggested nature's gradual preparation for dormancy. It was also during this month that Rosalind had begun to recognize with certainty that she was with child, that the particular physical changes that her body was undergoing suggested that the conscious choosing of partnership that she and Marcus had undertaken was beginning to manifest in tangible biological reality. She had not immediately articulated this knowledge to Marcus, had instead spent several weeks observing her own body with a combination of wonder and anxiety, had contemplated the particular implications of pregnancy while Marcus remained occupied with the particular demands of autumn estate operations. The harvest was commencing, and he had undertaken the work of ensuring that agricultural operations proceeded with appropriate efficiency and that various obligations to tenants were fulfilled as the growing season came to conclusion. It had been Ellen who had first articulated the particular observation that Rosalind suspected she would eventually require someone to articulate for her. "If I may speak plainly, Miss, your Grace, that is, you appear to be increasing. Is there something you wish me to prepare regarding your wardrobe? There are particular garments that accommodate such condition quite effectively." The casual articulation of what Rosalind had been contemplating privately had seemed to rupture something within her, had seemed to make real what had previously existed in a state of private recognition. She had confirmed Ellen's observation with quiet acknowledgement, had undertaken the particular work of beginning to understand what pregnancy would mean for her body and for her partnership with Marcus. That evening, she had chosen to articulate the knowledge to Marcus in the library, had positioned herself beside him as he had been reviewing estate accounts, and had stated with careful deliberation, "I have something to communicate to you that I believe you will regard as significant information." He had set down his pen immediately, had turned to regard her with the particular attention that suggested he understood that her communication involved something of considerable importance. "I am with child," she had stated simply, and she had perceived in his expression the particular progression from surprise to comprehension to something that approximated joy, yet joy that was complicated by the particular knowledge he carried regarding his own health and mortality. "You are certain?" he had asked, and there had been something in his tone suggesting he was assessing not merely whether she was certain of the fact itself, but rather whether she was certain that she was prepared for the particular implications of such fact. "I am as certain as one can be without formal assessment by physician," Rosalind had replied. "Yet I believe the evidence is sufficiently compelling that we should undertake arrangement for Dr. Mercer to examine me and to confirm what I already suspect to be true." What had followed had been an extended moment of silence, in which Marcus had seemed to be contemplating the particular reality that their partnership was about to produce not merely the emotional and spiritual transformation that had characterized their marriage, but also was about to produce a separate living person who would constitute tangible extension of their connection into the future. He had moved toward her, had drawn her into his arms with particular care, had seemed to be holding her with recognition of both the fragility and the extraordinary strength that pregnancy represented. "I am terrified," he had articulated against her hair, "not of the childbirth itself, though I recognize that such experience constitutes significant physical and emotional challenge. Rather, I am terrified regarding what my declining health may mean for your pregnancy, regarding what such decline may mean for my capacity to be present for you during this experience, regarding what my illness may mean for the child who is being created. Yet simultaneously, I am aware that such child represents the most profound expression of what we have created together, represents our faith that meaning can emerge even within limitation, that creation is possible even when future is uncertain. Then we will face this particular challenge as we have faced all others," Rosalind had replied. "We will undertake the pregnancy and the birth and the early motherhood with conscious awareness of the particular circumstances we are navigating. We will ensure that whatever limitations your health presents, They do not prevent us from creating what we are capable of creating. We will build something of value precisely because we understand the particular value of time and presence and intentional commitment. Dr. Mercer had confirmed her pregnancy in early September, had undertaken comprehensive examination, and had provided instruction regarding the particular care that would be necessary during the coming months. He had addressed his remarks to both Marcus and Rosalind, had seemed to be assessing both the mother-to-be and the father-to-be, and had ultimately offered assessment that was carefully balanced between appropriate concern and appropriate confidence. "The Duchess appears to be in good health," he had stated, directing his remarks particularly to Rosalind. "Pregnancy should proceed without complication, assuming appropriate rest and appropriate attention to nutrition. I would counsel against excessive activity, though moderate exercise and movement remain beneficial. Your Grace," he had continued, addressing Marcus directly, "you are aware, I trust, that pregnancy and childbirth will place considerable emotional and physical demands upon your wife. I would counsel that you ensure she receives appropriate support and appropriate consideration during this period." Marcus had assured him that Rosalind would receive whatever support and care she required, and Rosalind had perceived in his expression the particular seriousness with which he was undertaking this responsibility. The knowledge of pregnancy had seemed to catalyze particular shift in how Rosalind's body occupied space, had seemed to render increasingly evident the particular transformation that was occurring. By the end of September, her waist had begun to thicken noticeably, had begun to render obvious to anyone observing her that something had changed in her physical being. She had undertaken the particular work of adjusting to garments that accommodated the changes in her body, had begun to recognize how pregnancy altered not merely her physical form, but her entire relationship to her own body and to the physical world around her. What had perhaps most significantly altered was her relationship with Marcus, or rather had revealed depths to their connection that might not otherwise have been articulated. He had begun to undertake various small acts of care that seemed to recognize her particular physical vulnerability, had begun to ensure that she was offered comfortable seating, had begun to offer his arm when she navigated stairs or uneven ground, had begun to spend increasing amounts of time in her presence, as though her pregnancy had rendered her somehow both more fragile and more infinitely precious. On one particular evening in late September, as they had been walking together through the gardens in the fading light of approaching evening, he had placed his hand upon her thickening waist, had felt perhaps the earliest movements of the child that was being created within her, and had seemed to perceive with particular acuteness the reality that their partnership was generating something tangible and real and separate from themselves. "Our child," he had stated, wonder evident in his voice, "something that we have created together, something that will exist in the world as evidence of what we have built, something that will constitute continuation of what we have become together." "Yes," Rosalind had replied, and she had perceived that she was articulating understanding that extended far beyond the single word, that their conscious choosing of partnership, their decision to commit despite limitation, was manifesting in this particular creation, this particular new life that would represent their capacity to generate meaning and value and hope, despite the particular darkness that also existed within their circumstances. October had arrived with the particular beauty that characterized autumn at Ashcroft House, with gardens transforming into palette of gold and crimson, with mornings that required additional layers of clothing, with particular quality of light that suggested the approaching winter, with all the metaphorical weight that such approach carried. Rosalind had begun to experience pregnancy not as abstract concept, but as daily embodied reality, had begun to understand the particular ways that creating new life altered one's relationship to one's own body and to the physical world. The physical changes had continued their progression. Her waist had expanded further, her breasts had become more tender and more noticeably enlarged. Her center of gravity had shifted in manner that altered how she moved through space. Helen had undertaken the work of ensuring that appropriate garments were available, had recognized without judgment the particular realities of pregnancy, and had offered practical assistance in managing the various physical adjustments that pregnancy demanded. Yet what had perhaps been most significantly altered was not Rosalind's relationship to her own body, but rather her relationship with Marcus. He had begun to observe her with particular intensity, had begun to regard her physical transformation with something that appeared to constitute deep admiration and deep recognition of the particular strength that pregnancy represented. He had undertaken various physical accommodations, had begun to ensure that she was never required to undertake household tasks that might present physical strain, had begun to ensure that she was offered appropriate rest and appropriate comfort. More significantly, he had begun to undertake the particular work of learning about pregnancy and childbirth, had begun to consult with Dr. Mercer regarding the particular processes that her body would undergo, had begun to read various texts that addressed the management of pregnancy and the anticipation of childbirth. It had been during one evening when Rosalind had observed him reading a medical treatise regarding childbirth that she had recognized how thoroughly he was undertaking the work of preparation, not merely physical preparation, but emotional and intellectual preparation for what the birth of their child would require. "You are preparing yourself," she had observed, sitting beside him in the library and observing the text he was studying. "I am attempting to understand what your body will undergo," he had replied, setting down the book. "I am attempting to comprehend the particular physical challenges that childbirth will present. I am attempting to recognize what will be required of me as partner during that experience." The texts available on such subjects are not particularly detailed regarding the emotional dimensions of the experience, but they communicate sufficiently that childbirth is considerable undertaking, physically, emotionally, spiritually. "Are you afraid?" Rosalind had asked, and she had perceived that the question was addressing something deeper than mere anxiety regarding the birth itself. "Yes," he had replied simply. "I am afraid for you. I am afraid of the particular physical challenges that your body will face. I am afraid of what might occur should complications emerge. I am afraid of what your pain might be and of my limitation in preventing such pain. I am afraid of what my own declining health might mean for my capacity to support you during such experience. Yet I am also determined that such fear will not prevent me from being fully present, from offering whatever support is possible, from ensuring that you are not undertaking this alone. That is what partnership requires, is it not? Not the absence of fear, but rather the conscious choosing to remain present despite fear." "Yes," Rosalind had replied, and she had reached for his hand and had held it with the particular grip that seemed to communicate something beyond words. "That is precisely what partnership requires." The particular knowledge of his illness had begun to manifest in subtle ways as October had progressed. There had been certain mornings when he had emerged from their shared chambers with slightly less vigor than was typical, with certain movements that suggested his body was experiencing particular strain. There had been certain evenings when he had required to rest earlier than was his custom, when Rosalind had perceived that he was managing particular fatigue that seemed to represent the gradual progression of his condition. Yet he had continued to undertake his responsibilities with apparent determination to ensure that his declining health did not prevent him from functioning in his role as Duke. He had continued his morning rides, though she had perceived that the duration had begun to shorten. He had continued his work with estate operations, though she had begun to observe that he required to rest more frequently than he had in earlier months. He had continued to be present with her during the evenings, had continued to ensure that she received appropriate attention and care, though she had begun to perceive the particular effort that such presence was requiring of him. It had been during one particular evening in late October, when he had emerged from his study visibly fatigued and had positioned himself beside her with careful deliberation, that she had articulated with directness what she had been observing. "Your condition is progressing. You are experiencing increasing fatigue. The particular physical demands that you are undertaking are becoming more challenging for you." He had not attempted to deny her observation, had instead regarded her with expression suggesting he was grateful for her directness and her refusal to permit him to minimize what was occurring. "Yes," he had acknowledged, "the progression appears to be advancing more rapidly than Dr. Mercer had anticipated. I have undertaken to continue with my responsibilities to the extent possible, yet I am aware that the extent possible is gradually reducing. I am attempting to ensure that I accomplish what must be accomplished before my condition renders me incapable of such accomplishment. Yet I am simultaneously aware that such attempt to accomplish may be hastening the very progression I am attempting to manage. Then you must permit others to undertake certain responsibilities," Rosalind had stated with firmness that suggested she was not permitting argumentation regarding this particular matter. "You must permit me to undertake more of the household management. You must permit the steward to manage certain estate operations. You must undertake the work of preserving your energy for what matters most, for ensuring that you are present for this pregnancy, for ensuring that you are present for the birth of our child, for ensuring that you have opportunity to know this child. Such priorities constitute your most important responsibilities. All else is secondary. Marcus had regarded her in silence for an extended moment, and she had perceived that he was recognizing the particular validity of what she was articulating, was recognizing that his attempt to manage his condition through continued activity was counterproductive to the larger purpose of creating the kind of presence that would constitute his genuine legacy. "You are correct," he had stated finally. "I have been attempting to manage my condition through denial and through activity, believing that such management would permit me to pretend that my health is not progressively declining. Yet such pretense serves no one, serves neither you, nor our unborn child, nor myself. I will undertake the work of acknowledging my particular limitations and of ensuring that my remaining energy is devoted to what truly matters." This conversation had seemed to mark a particular turning point in how Marcus undertook his engagement with the world, had seemed to mark his acceptance that his declining health was not something to be managed through denial, but rather was something to be acknowledged and integrated into his conscious choosing of how to spend his remaining time and energy. November had arrived with the particular bleakness that characterized late autumn, had brought bare branches and grey skies, and the particular quality of light that suggested winter was approaching with inexorable certainty. It was during this month that Rosalind's pregnancy had become visibly evident to the entire household and to the broader community. The Dowager Duchess had called upon her, had observed her evident pregnancy, and had offered assessment that had been simultaneously characteristically austere and surprisingly warm. "You are carrying well," Lady Constance had stated, observing Rosalind with the particular scrutiny that seemed to comprise the bulk of her interaction with the world. "You appear healthy. Your bearing suggests strength. These are favorable indicators. The child will be born at what month? Spring, approximately?" "April, most likely," Rosalind had replied. "Late April or early May, based on Dr. Mercer's assessment." "Excellent," Lady Constance had stated. "Spring birth is preferable to other seasons. The weather will be favorable. Recovery will be less complicated than it would be in harsher seasons. I trust that my son is undertaking appropriate responsibility in ensuring that you receive necessary support and care during this period." "He is being extraordinarily attentive," Rosalind had replied, and she had perceived in the Dowager's expression what might have been recognition that her son was demonstrating capacity for genuine care that had perhaps not been evident during his previous marriage. The household had begun to undertake the particular preparations that pregnancy and approaching childbirth demanded. Certain rooms had been prepared for the arrival of the child, certain items had been procured, certain arrangements had been made regarding Dr. Mercer's attendance during the birthing process and regarding Mrs. Cordelia Hastings, the experienced midwife, who had been engaged to provide primary assistance during the labor and delivery. Yet what had perhaps been most significant during November had been the particular deepening of vulnerability that had characterized Marcus and Rosalind's private relationship. The acknowledgement of his declining health had seemed to catalyze increased willingness on his part to articulate what he was experiencing, to offer Rosalind not merely the performance of stability, but rather the genuine reality of what his body was undergoing. There had been several evenings when he had emerged from dressing for dinner visibly fatigued, when he had indicated that he would require to retire earlier than was his custom, when Rosalind had perceived that he was experiencing particular physical strain that he was attempting to manage without imposing upon others. She had begun during these moments to undertake the particular work of caring for him in ways that mirrored the ways he had cared for her, had begun to ensure that he received appropriate comfort, appropriate rest, appropriate consideration for his particular needs. One evening, as he had been sitting before the fireplace in their shared chambers, his body seeming to curve inward with fatigue, she had positioned herself beside him and had undertaken to remove his boots and to ensure that he was positioned with appropriate comfort. The simple act of physical care had seemed to rupture something within him, had seemed to permit particular vulnerability to emerge that had perhaps been constrained by his determination to maintain the role of protector and provider. "I am afraid," he had articulated, his voice barely audible in the quiet of the chamber, "I am afraid that I will not remain long enough to know our child. I am afraid that the particular progression of my illness may render me absent for significant portions of the child's life. I am afraid that you will be required to undertake motherhood without the partnership that I wish to offer. I am afraid that what I am capable of offering will prove inadequate to what is required." Rosalind had moved to sit beside him, had taken his hand, and had remained present with the particular quality of silence that such articulation required. She had recognized that what he was experiencing was not mere physical fatigue, but was emotional devastation regarding the particular limitations that his condition represented, regarding the particular recognition that what he wished to give and what he was capable of giving were increasingly divergent. "What you have already offered," she had stated finally, "exceeds what I could have anticipated when I accepted marriage to you. You have offered genuine presence. You have offered authentic vulnerability. You have offered conscious commitment to partnership despite limitation. These offerings constitute gift that will remain with me and with our child, regardless of how much time remains available to you. The particular length of your life does not determine the depth of your impact upon those who know you. The particular duration of your presence does not diminish the value of what you have created." He had drawn her close then, had held her with the particular intensity that seemed to characterize moments when he was truly permitting himself to acknowledge both his love and his fear regarding what that love might be required to face. It had been during this month that Rosalind had begun to perceive with increasing clarity the particular reality that she would be required, eventually, to undertake significant portions of life as widow, had begun to understand that the particular partnership they had created, however genuine and however profound, was bounded by temporal limitation that was becoming increasingly evident. Rather than this realization creating distance between them, it had seemed to create deeper commitment, had seemed to render both of them increasingly conscious that the particular time they possessed together required to be spent with maximum intentionality and maximum presence. By the end of November, as the first snow had fallen upon the gardens of Ashcroft House, and as winter had begun to establish itself in earnest, something had shifted in how they occupied their partnership. Marcus had ceased attempting to maintain the pretense that his health was not significantly impacted by his condition. Rosalind had undertaken increasingly significant portions of household management and estate oversight. Yet simultaneously, their relationship had deepened into something that seemed to transcend the particular roles they undertook, had deepened into something that constituted recognition that the particular value of their partnership existed not in the performance of duties, but in the conscious choosing of presence and vulnerability and authentic commitment to one another. December had arrived with particular harshness, had brought significant snowfall, had brought cold that required fires throughout the house, and had brought the particular quality of darkness that characterized winter months. It was during this month that Marcus's condition had begun to manifest in increasingly visible ways. He had begun to experience particular fatigue that was nearly constant, had begun to require increasing amounts of rest, had begun to move through the household with deliberation that suggested each movement required conscious effort and conscious management of his body's declining capability. Dr. Mercer had been called to examine him with increasing frequency, and his assessments had been carefully calibrated, yet increasingly grave. The progression of Marcus's illness was advancing more rapidly than had been anticipated, and the particular manifestations of his declining health suggested that he had perhaps fewer years remaining than he had previously believed. Yet Dr. Mercer had been careful to articulate that such decline was not necessarily imminent, that Marcus might have several more years available to him, though such years would likely be characterized by increasingly limited physical capability and increasing need for rest and recovery. It had been during one particularly difficult evening in early December, when Marcus's deterioration had become apparent even to the broader household, when he had collapsed during dinner, when his body had seemed to betray him in manner so evident that even his attempts at concealment could no longer be maintained. He had recovered consciousness within moments, yet the fall had been significant enough that both Rosalind and the assembled servants had recognized that something had fundamentally shifted in his condition. Dr. Mercer had been summoned, had undertaken examination, and had offered assessment that was sufficiently grave that he had requested to speak with both Marcus and Rosalind privately. He had undertaken conversation with careful attention to articulation of truth without unnecessary embellishment, yet without minimization of what was occurring. "The progression appears to be more rapid than I anticipated," he had stated, his voice carrying the particular gravity that such assessment required. "The particular incident this evening, while not themselves life-threatening, indicates that the condition is advancing into stage in which physical vulnerability is becoming more evident. I would counsel that His Grace undertake considerable rest, that he reduce his engagement with activities that require physical exertion, and that he prepare himself and his household for the particular reality that the coming months may present increasing challenges. "How much time does he have?" Rosalind had asked directly, and she had perceived in Dr. Mercer's expression recognition that she was asking the question that everyone was contemplating, yet no one wished to articulate. "Based on the particular progression," Dr. Mercer had replied carefully, "I would estimate that His Grace has perhaps 1 to 2 years remaining, possibly longer, should the progression slow unexpectedly, possibly shorter should complications emerge. The particular manifestations he is experiencing suggest that the illness is advancing more rapidly than typical. However, individuals with similar conditions have been known to experience extended periods of relative stability despite the general trajectory of decline. The knowledge of such limitation had seemed to transform something in how Marcus undertook his engagement with existence. Rather than despair, what had emerged was particular quality of determination to ensure that certain things were accomplished, certain matters were addressed, certain arrangements were made to ensure that Rosalind and their unborn child would be provided for after his death. He had undertaken consultation with various legal professionals regarding his will and regarding the particular arrangements that would be necessary to ensure that the estate and the title would pass appropriately, and that Rosalind would be provided with security and resources that would permit her to undertake life as widow, with dignity and with capacity for independent action. He had undertaken consultation with his solicitors regarding financial matters, regarding investments, regarding the particular mechanisms through which Rosalind would maintain control over resources necessary for her own autonomy. More significantly, he had undertaken the particular work of articulating to Rosalind the various matters that he had been contemplating regarding their future, regarding what would be required to manage the household after his death, regarding what arrangements he was making to ensure that she would never be dependent upon the charity or the goodwill of others. It had been during one such conversation, on a particularly cold evening in mid-December, that he had articulated something that had seemed to move beyond the practical matters that had been occupying his attention. "I wish to ensure that our child knows me. I wish to undertake the particular work of creating something, perhaps through written word, perhaps through other means, that will permit our child to understand who I am, what I have valued, what I wish to communicate to them across the boundary of my death. I wish to create something that will constitute my presence in their life even after I am no longer physically present." Rosalind had recognized immediately the particular significance of what he was articulating, had recognized that he was undertaking the work of ensuring that his death would not constitute complete absence, that his child would have means of knowing him and understanding him despite the particular temporal limitation that his declining health represented. "What form should such creation take?" she had asked, and she had perceived that the question was genuinely seeking guidance regarding how to support what he was attempting to accomplish. "I wish to write letters," he had replied, "letters to be opened at various stages of our child's life, at birth, at childhood, at adolescence, at adulthood. I wish to articulate in such letters what I wish for our child, what I have learned through my own existence, what I hope they will carry forward into their own life and their own choices. I wish to ensure that such child understands that they were created out of genuine love, out of conscious partnership, out of hope that even within the boundaries of mortality and limitation, meaning and value can be created. I believe that is extraordinary undertaking," Rosalind had stated, and she had perceived that she was articulating recognition of the particular courage that such work required. "I will support you in such creation. I will ensure that you have whatever time and space and support is necessary to articulate what you wish to communicate." It had been during the final week of December, as the household had undertaken the particular preparations for Christmas celebration, that Marcus had begun to undertake this work in earnest, had begun to spend extended periods in the study, had begun to create the letters that would constitute his voice across time and across his eventual death. Rosalind had provided assistance where requested, had ensured that he had appropriate comfort and appropriate rest, and had recognized that the particular work he was undertaking represented his most profound act of presence and of love, represented his determination that his existence and his love would not be erased by his death, but would continue to exist and to constitute force in the world through the child who would carry something of him forward into the future. The arrival of January had brought with it the particular knowledge that the old year had passed, and that new year was establishing itself with all the metaphorical weight that such transition represented. The Christmas season at Ashcroft House had been undertaken with particular quality of deliberation, with recognition that Marcus's declining health rendered such celebration both more precious and more tinged with awareness of limitation. The household had undertaken the particular work of creating celebration that honored both the season and the reality of the household's particular circumstances. Rosalind's pregnancy had advanced significantly. She was now in final months before the anticipated birth in April or May, and her body reflected the particular reality of carrying child toward the moment of arrival. The physical changes that she was experiencing had rendered her increasingly focused on the particular reality of approaching motherhood, had rendered her aware that in the coming months she would be undertaking the work of bringing new life into the world, while simultaneously acknowledging that the father of that child was experiencing progressive decline that would likely render him unable to participate in all but the earliest stages of his child's life. It had been during the first week of January, as Rosalind and Marcus had been occupying the library together, he reading and resting, she engaged in needlework that was intended to occupy her hands with useful activity, that he had articulated something that had seemed to represent particular recognition of what they had created together. "I have been contemplating," he had stated, setting down his book and regarding her with expression of particular intensity, "what our marriage has accomplished. I have been recognizing what began as transaction, as business arrangement undertaken to address your father's financial circumstances and to fulfill my obligations regarding the succession, has transformed into something entirely different. I have been recognizing that we have created something genuine and something valuable that exists independent of the particular temporal limitations that characterize my physical existence." "What have we created?" Rosalind had asked, and she had perceived that the question was genuinely seeking his articulation of what he believed they had accomplished. "We have created partnership grounded in genuine presence," he had replied thoughtfully. "We have created recognition that authentic love does not require the absence of limitation or the absence of fear, but rather requires the conscious choosing to remain vulnerable despite such limitation and such fear. We have created something that extends beyond both of us individually, created it through the child who is coming, created it through the ways we have transformed one another, created it through the particular choice to commit to authenticity rather than to retreat into protective distance." He had paused, and Rosalind had perceived that he was contemplating something with the particular intensity that suggested profound significance. "More than that," he had continued, "I believe we have created something that offers redemption, not redemption from mortality, which is impossible, but rather redemption through recognition that meaning can be created within mortality, that value can be generated within limitation, that what appears to be obstacle or curse might instead be opportunity to create something of genuine worth. My declining health, which seemed to represent tragedy, has instead become occasion through which we have been compelled to undertake genuine partnership and genuine presence. Had I possessed infinite time, had I possessed confidence in endless future, I might never have undertaken the work of truly knowing you and truly being known by you. My limitation has paradoxically become my greatest gift, has rendered me capable of creating something with you that I might never have created had I possessed the illusion of infinite time." Rosalind had set down her needlework, had risen from her chair despite the particular awkwardness that her pregnancy created, and had positioned herself beside him. She had taken his hand and had held it with the particular grip that seemed to communicate something beyond words. "You have offered me redemption as well," she had articulated, her voice carrying the particular emotion that the moment seemed to require. "I came to this marriage, grieving the loss of a different future, grieving for the life I had imagined I might have had with someone I would have chosen freely, grieving for the particular autonomy that my father's financial circumstances had cost me. Yet what I have discovered is that the future that was denied me was far less valuable than the future that has emerged from my commitment to you. I have discovered that genuine partnership requires not the absence of obligation, but rather the conscious transformation of obligation into choice. I have discovered that presence, true presence, authentic presence, is worth far more than the abstract possibility of a different life that I might have imagined." He had drawn her close then, had held her with the particular care that her pregnancy required, had seemed to be acknowledging in his embrace the particular reality of what they had created together, not merely a marriage, but a genuine partnership, not merely a child on the way, but a future that would extend beyond his own mortality through the particular creation that they had undertaken together. "I love you," he had stated simply, and the simplicity of the articulation had seemed to carry weight that more elaborate declaration might not have possessed. "I love what we have created together. I love the child who is coming. I love the woman you have become through your commitment to genuine presence with me. I am no longer afraid of what my declining health will mean, because I recognize that what we have created, what we continue to create, exists independent of the duration of my physical presence. I will be present for as much of our child's life as I am able, and what I am unable to be present for, you will be present for. And through both our presence and your continuation after my presence ceases, our child will know that they were created out of love, authentic, genuine, transformative love." It was in this moment in which Rosalind had recognized the particular depth of what they had created together, this moment in which Marcus had articulated his own recognition of what authentic love could accomplish even within the boundaries of mortality and limitation, that the entire trajectory of their relationship seemed to achieve its culmination. Not culmination in the sense of completion, but rather culmination in the sense of achieving its fullest expression and its deepest truth. That presence could transform everything, that vulnerability could create strength, that limitation could become occasion for creating meaning that would extend far beyond the temporal boundaries of individual existence. February had arrived with particular harshness, had brought extended periods of snow that rendered the grounds of Ashcroft House transformation into landscape of white and grey, and had brought cold that seemed to penetrate even the best heated rooms of the great house. It was during this month that the final phase of Rosalind's pregnancy had become fully evident. She was now in her 7th month, and her body had begun the particular preparations that preceded labor and delivery. The physical changes had become significant enough that even ordinary movement required considerable consideration and considerable care. Yet what had perhaps been more significant than the particular physical manifestations of her advancing pregnancy was the visible progression of Marcus's condition, the particular reality that as new life was preparing to arrive, Marcus's own physical decline was becoming increasingly evident to the entire household. There had been certain mornings when he had found himself unable to rise from bed with his customary ability. There had been certain evenings when he had required assistance with activities that he had previously undertaken independently. There had been certain moments when his breathing had become visibly labored, when Rosalind had perceived that the simple act of existing was requiring increasing effort and increasing conscious management. Dr. Mercer had begun calling at Ashcroft with increased frequency, had undertaken examinations of both Rosalind and Marcus, had offered assessments that were carefully balanced, yet increasingly grave. To Rosalind he had offered reassurance that her pregnancy was progressing appropriately, that she should anticipate labor sometime in April or early May, and that her overall health suggested she was capable of undertaking the birth without significant complication. To Marcus he had offered acknowledgement that the progression of his illness was continuing, that the particular manifestations he was experiencing suggested the decline was advancing, and that he should undertake as much rest as his responsibilities permitted. It had been during one particular evening in mid-February, when Marcus had been resting in their shared chambers, and when Rosalind had been undertaking the particular work of arranging items that would be required for the child's arrival, that she had perceived with particular acuteness the reality of their situation. She was preparing for new life, while simultaneously preparing for imminent loss. The juxtaposition of these two realities, creation and death existing simultaneously within the same household, the same chambers, the same shared existence, had seemed to rupture something within her consciousness, had seemed to render acute the particular tragedy and particular beauty of their circumstances. She had positioned herself on the edge of the bed, had observed her husband sleeping with the particular quality of vulnerability that sleep seemed to permit, and had found herself contemplating what the coming months would bring, the birth of their child, the final weeks or months of her husband's life, the requirement that she undertake the work of becoming mother, while simultaneously undertaking the work of becoming widow. Marcus had stirred then, had opened his eyes, and had perceived immediately from her expression that she was experiencing particular emotional distress. He had moved slowly, had positioned himself beside her despite the obvious physical effort that such movement required, and had undertaken the work of drawing her close with whatever strength remained available to him. "You are afraid," he had stated simply, and the directness of his observation had suggested he understood precisely what she was contemplating. "I am grieving," she had replied, and the honesty of admission had seemed to rupture something within both of them. "I am grieving for the loss that is coming. I am grieving for the child who will never know their father in any sustained way. I am grieving for the life that might have been possible had your health been different. I am grieving for you, for what you are losing, for what we are both losing." "And yet," Marcus had responded, his voice carrying particular quality of wisdom born from months of contemplating mortality, "what we are also creating is extraordinary. We are creating child who will exist as evidence of what authentic love can accomplish. We are creating partnership that will persist beyond my physical presence. We are creating legacy that will extend far into the future. The particular grief that you are experiencing is real and is appropriate, yet it exists alongside something equally real, the particular joy and the particular meaning that we are simultaneously creating." He had paused, had seemed to be gathering strength for continued articulation of what he was perceiving. "I wish to undertake something," he had continued, "while I still possess sufficient strength to undertake it. I wish to create particular document, not merely the letters I have been writing, but something more comprehensive. I wish to create record of what I have learned, what I value, what I wish to communicate not merely to our child, but to you, to those who will remain after I am gone. I wish to ensure that my understanding, my hard-won understanding regarding what matters and what does not matter, is preserved in manner that extends beyond my physical lifetime." "What form should such document take?" Rosalind had asked, recognizing immediately that this articulation represented particular importance to him. "Perhaps journal," he had suggested. "Perhaps something that articulates not merely narrative of events, but rather philosophy, understanding of what partnership means, what love requires, what authenticity demands. I wish to ensure that what we have learned together, what has been gained through our conscious commitment to genuine presence, is not lost when I am no longer physically present to articulate it." Rosalind had agreed immediately to support such undertaking, had recognized that his need to create lasting articulation of his understanding was expression of his determination that his death would not constitute complete cessation of his voice and his influence. In the weeks that had followed, Marcus had undertaken this work with particular focus, had spent portions of each day that his strength permitted in articulating, through written word, the particular wisdom that his illness and his marriage and his approaching fatherhood had generated. What had become evident through this process was that Marcus was undertaking not merely the work of creating record for future consumption, but rather was undertaking the work of clarifying for himself what his life had meant, what his marriage had accomplished, what his impending death represented within the larger framework of existence and meaning. The particular act of articulation seemed to constitute healing, seemed to permit him to integrate the various dimensions of his experience into coherent understanding that transformed loss into meaning. By the end of February, as the month had given way toward March and as Rosalind's pregnancy had advanced further toward its culmination, something had shifted in how Marcus undertook his engagement with his remaining time. He had ceased the particular attempt to minimize his declining condition, had ceased the particular pretense that he was maintaining any appearance of health, and had instead undertaken the work of ensuring that every moment of his remaining presence was devoted to what truly mattered, to ensuring that he was genuinely present with Rosalind, genuinely engaged in preparation for the child who was coming, and genuinely committed to the particular legacy that his death would be unable to erase. March had arrived with the particular quality of transition that characterized the arrival of spring, had brought increasing daylight, had brought certain stirrings of new growth in the gardens, and had brought the particular sense that the winter that had seemed so enduring was finally beginning its dissolution. Yet within Ashcroft House, the arrival of spring had seemed merely to emphasize the particular winter that was settling upon Marcus's physical being, the particular decline that seemed to accompany each passing week. By the middle of March, Marcus had ceased to pretend that he was capable of undertaking the ordinary responsibilities that his position required. He had transferred significant portions of estate management to his steward, had undertaken consultation with various trusted advisors regarding matters that would require attention after his death, and had undertaken the particular work of ensuring that Rosalind possessed comprehensive understanding of the financial and practical dimensions of her role as wife and eventual widow. He had become increasingly dependent upon assistance for tasks that he had previously undertaken independently. There had been certain mornings when he had required help in dressing, certain evenings when he had required assistance in moving from one room to another, and certain nights when his breathing had become sufficiently compromised that Rosalind had found herself remaining awake, vigilant, ensuring that he was able to continue breathing through whatever difficulty his body was presenting. Yet rather than such physical limitations seeming to diminish him, it had seemed instead to clarify something fundamental about him. It had seemed to render evident the particular dignity and the particular quality of spirit that had existed beneath his physical form. He had begun to undertake extended conversations with various members of the household, with Mrs. Whitmore regarding the management of household operations after his death, with Dr. Mercer regarding the particular arrangements that would be necessary once his condition reached terminal stage, with the Dowager Duchess regarding the particular support that she would be capable of offering Rosalind and the child who was coming. More significantly, he had undertaken the work of ensuring that Rosalind possessed not merely practical knowledge regarding the management of household and estate, but rather possessed understanding of his particular values and his particular priorities regarding how such management should be undertaken. They had spent countless hours in conversation, during which he had articulated to her the particular relationships that mattered, the particular obligations that he felt toward various individuals and families, the particular principles that should guide her decisions when he was no longer present to guide them directly. It had been during one such conversation, late in March, that he had articulated something that had seemed to constitute particular turning point in his acceptance of his approaching death. "I am no longer afraid," he had stated, and Rosalind had perceived that he was articulating truth born from weeks of contemplating what his death would mean and what it would not mean. "What has changed?" she had asked, recognizing that something had indeed shifted in his internal experience. "I have recognized," he had replied with the particular clarity that seemed to characterize his thoughts when he was speaking from depth of genuine understanding, "that my death is not the tragedy that I had feared it to be. The tragedy would have been to live in such manner that my death would constitute erasure, would constitute cessation of all that I am and all that I represent. Yet because of what we have created together, because of the particular partnership that we have undertaken, because of the child who is coming into the world as manifestation of our love, my death will not constitute such erasure. I will persist through our child. I will persist through the values and the principles that I am transmitting to you. I will persist through the particular legacy of authentic partnership that will remain in the world after my body has ceased to function." He had paused, and Rosalind had perceived that he was contemplating something with the particular intensity that seemed to characterize his most profound thoughts. "More than that," he had continued, "I have recognized that what matters is not the particular duration of existence, but rather is the particular quality of how such existence is undertaken. I have lived more fully in these months with you than I lived in all the years before you arrived at Ashcroft. I have experienced more authentic connection, more genuine love, more conscious meaning-making in these final months than I experienced in decades of merely existing. Therefore, while my death is approaching, and while I do not welcome the particular pain and the particular limitation that my illness continues to produce, I am no longer afraid of the approaching ending. I am instead grateful for what I have experienced, grateful for the time that I have had, grateful for the particular transformation that has occurred through our partnership." Such articulation had seemed to transform the particular atmosphere of the household, had seemed to permit the various members of the household to recognize that what was occurring was not merely tragedy to be endured, but rather was particular kind of grace that accompanied recognition that life, despite its limitation, could be lived in manner characterized by profound meaning and profound love. The Dowager Duchess had seemed particularly moved by this transformation in her son, had seemed to recognize that the particular distance that had characterized him for so much of his life had been replaced by unexpected openness and unexpected willingness to articulate his feelings and his values. She had begun to undertake conversations with both Marcus and Rosalind regarding the particular support that she would offer after his death, and she had seemed to recognize that Rosalind was not woman who would require to be controlled or directed, but rather was woman capable of undertaking independent management of her own life and the life of the household. By the end of March, as spring had begun to assert itself more definitively, and as Rosalind's pregnancy had advanced into its final weeks, something had become evident to everyone who occupied Ashcroft House. The particular cycle of life and death was revealing itself in its most essential form, was revealing itself in the reality that even as one life was approaching its conclusion, another life was preparing to enter into the world. The particular tragedy and the particular grace of this coincidence seemed to constitute the very heart of what it meant to be human, seemed to constitute the particular terrain in which authentic meaning and authentic love could be discovered. April had arrived with remarkable transformation, had brought sudden warmth that had seemed almost shocking after the prolonged winter, had brought gardens bursting into new growth and new flower, and had brought the particular sense that the world was undertaking renewal and rebirth on magnificent scale. Yet within Ashcroft House, the arrival of April had seemed to bring recognition of particular irony. As nature was renewing itself, as gardens were preparing to produce abundance, as all of creation seemed to be engaged in the particular work of generation and continuation, Marcus was entering the final phase of his decline, was entering the time in which his physical body was preparing for its final cessation. Rosalind had entered the final weeks of her pregnancy, was experiencing the particular physical changes that suggested labor would commence within days or weeks rather than months. Her belly had grown enormous, had made ordinary movement increasingly challenging, and had rendered her profoundly conscious of the particular reality that her body was engaged in the work of creating new life. Yet this consciousness of creating life had existed alongside acute consciousness that she was simultaneously losing the man she had come to love profoundly. Dr. Mercer had begun calling at Ashcroft with even greater frequency, had undertaken examination of both Rosalind and Marcus, had offered assessment to Rosalind that labor could commence at any time and that she should prepare herself for the particular work that birthing would require. To Marcus, he had undertaken examination that had been sufficiently thorough to suggest that Dr. Mercer was assessing not merely his current condition, but was attempting to ascertain whether Marcus possessed sufficient strength to survive even to the moment of the child's arrival. It had been during one such examination, when Dr. Mercer had emerged from Marcus's chambers and had encountered Rosalind in the hallway, that the physician had undertaken to communicate particular concern. "I believe you should prepare yourself for the possibility that His Grace's condition may reach terminal stage at any time. I do not wish to suggest that death is imminent. I believe he may have weeks remaining, possibly longer, yet I wish to be honest regarding the particular trajectory that his condition is undertaking. I would counsel that you ensure you have opportunity to communicate whatever remains to be communicated." Rosalind had recognized the particular gravity with which Dr. Mercer was offering this counsel, had recognized that he was articulating his honest assessment that Marcus did not have unlimited time remaining, and had undertaken immediately to ensure that she was spending whatever time remained in conscious presence with her husband. It had been that very evening that she had undertaken to articulate to Marcus what Dr. Mercer had communicated. "Your condition is approaching terminal stage. Dr. Mercer believes you have weeks, perhaps longer, but he is no longer confident regarding the outcome. I wish to know whether there remains anything that you believe you have not yet articulated or communicated." Marcus had seemed unsurprised by her directness, had seemed, in fact, to have been anticipating such conversation. He had drawn her close to him, had held her with the particular care that her pregnancy required, and had articulated with characteristic clarity what he had been contemplating. "I am at peace," he had stated simply. "I have articulated through written word what I believed required to be articulated. I have ensured that arrangements are in place for your security and for the management of the household after my death. I have undertaken the work of clarifying what matters and what does not matter. What remains is merely to be present with you during these final weeks, to ensure that I am available to greet our child should I survive until the moment of birth, and to permit myself to experience whatever time remains without attempting to manage or control what is occurring. If I am spared to witness the birth, I am grateful. If I am not, I am grateful for the months that have been granted to me." The particular peace that he articulated had seemed to constitute gift, had seemed to permit Rosalind to release certain of the expectations she had carried regarding what his final weeks should accomplish or should represent. Rather than attempting to ensure that certain things were said or certain things were done, she had undertaken instead the particular work of being present with him, of offering whatever comfort and whatever companionship her presence could provide. In the days and weeks that had followed, as April had progressed toward May, Rosalind had found herself undertaking a particular kind of sacred work, the work of being present with someone who was approaching death, of offering through physical proximity and through conscious attention the kind of presence that seemed to matter far more than words or actions. She had spent hours sitting beside him while he rested, had undertaken the work of reading to him when he was capable of attention, had undertaken the work of simply existing in his presence in manner that communicated that she was not regarding him merely as husband facing death, but rather was regarding him as person who deserved her full and complete presence. The particular irony of their situation had become increasingly evident. As her body had been engaged in the work of creating new life, his body had been engaged in the work of releasing life, and yet both processes had seemed to possess particular beauty, seemed to constitute expression of particular kind of sacred cycle, in which creation and cessation, birth and death, seemed to exist not as opposites, but rather as complementary dimensions of single, overarching reality. By the end of April, as the month had given way toward May, and as Rosalind's pregnancy had reached its absolute culmination, something had become evident. The particular moment was approaching when new life would enter the world, and when the man who had created that life might or might not possess sufficient strength to greet that arrival. The particular intersection of birth and death, creation and cessation, seemed to constitute the very apex of their story, seemed to constitute the moment in which all that they had created together would be tested and would be revealed in its fullest truth. The evening of May 2nd had arrived with particular quality of stillness, with air that seemed to possess particular weight, with consciousness throughout the household that something significant was approaching. Rosalind had been resting in her chambers when the first genuine contraction had arrived, had been a sensation so distinct from the preparatory contractions that had characterized the preceding weeks that she had recognized immediately what was occurring. Labor had commenced. Her body was beginning the particular work of bringing new life into the world. She had not immediately called for assistance, had instead undertaken the particular work of observing what her body was experiencing, had undertaken the work of breathing through the initial contractions with the particular consciousness that she had been preparing for this moment for months. When the contractions had begun to establish regular pattern, when the intensity had increased sufficiently to suggest that genuine labor was underway, she had rung for Ellen and had undertaken to communicate that the time had arrived. Word had spread through the household with remarkable rapidity. Mrs. Whitmore had appeared to ensure that arrangements were in place. Dr. Mercer had been summoned. Mrs. Cordelia Hastings, the experienced midwife who had been engaged for the birth, had been brought to the chambers where labor would unfold, and Marcus had been informed and had undertaken immediately to move to the chambers adjacent to where Rosalind would labor, had positioned himself such that he could be available should she require his presence. The labor had proceeded with remarkable progression, had not been swift, but had possessed particular quality of inevitability and particular sense that Rosalind's body knew precisely what required to be accomplished. Hour after hour had unfolded as she had moved through various positions, had breathed through the waves of pain and effort that her contractions produced, had undertaken the particular work of surrendering to her body's knowledge of how to bring new life into the world. Marcus had been present throughout the labor, had remained nearby, had offered his presence and his support in whatever manner was required. There had been certain moments when she had required the particular grounding of his physical presence, had reached for his hand, had held on to him as though his presence constituted anchor in the particular storm of sensation and effort that labor created. He had remained calm, had spoken to her with particular quality of encouragement and recognition, had demonstrated through his presence that he was with her in this, that she was not undertaking this alone. The actual delivery had occurred at dawn on May 3rd, had occurred in that particular moment when exhaustion and effort and weeks of preparation had converged into single culminating moment in which new life had exited from Rosalind's body into the world. Mrs. Hastings had guided the birth with remarkable skill, had offered instruction and encouragement, and then suddenly there had been new person, small and slippery and remarkable, emerging into the light and the air and the particular reality of separate existence. "You have a son," Mrs. Hastings had announced, and the particular reality of those words had seemed to transform everything in the space of single moment. A son, a boy child. Living manifestation of what Marcus and Rosalind had created together. The infant had been born to cry, had announced his arrival with sound that had seemed to express the particular shock and the particular wonder of encountering separate existence for the first time. Mrs. Hastings had undertaken the particular work of cleaning the infant, had wrapped him in soft cloth, and had placed him into Rosalind's arms, had placed the newly arrived human being into the arms of the woman who had created him within her own body. Rosalind had found herself unable to articulate what she was experiencing, had found herself observing the small face, the tiny fingers, the particular quality of vulnerability and of extraordinary presence that characterized the newly born child. She had perceived in the infant's features something of herself and something of Marcus, perceived in the configuration of face and the quality of expression the particular genetic continuation of both parents into this new being. And then Marcus had entered the chamber. He had been assisted by Mrs. Whitmore, had moved slowly and with considerable effort, had positioned himself beside the bed where Rosalind was sitting with their son. He had observed the child with expression of such profound emotion that Rosalind had perceived in his face the particular revelation of what fatherhood meant, what creation of new life signified, what the particular continuation of himself into this separate human being represented. "He is perfect," Marcus had stated, his voice barely audible, and Rosalind had perceived that he was articulating something far deeper than mere observation of the infant's physical characteristics. She had understood that he was articulating recognition that despite all his suffering, despite all his illness, despite all the particular limitation that his condition represented, he had been granted the extraordinary grace of witnessing the arrival of his own child. He had reached out with trembling hand and had touched the infant's face with remarkable gentleness, had offered through that particular gesture something that transcended words, something that articulated his love and his recognition and his profound gratitude that he had been spared long enough to greet this new life. "What shall we name him?" Marcus had asked, and Rosalind had perceived that he was undertaking the particular work of ensuring that the child possessed identity, possessed name that would constitute his being in the world. "Edward," Rosalind had replied, and she had perceived that the name had come to her from some deep place of knowing. "Edward James, for those who have shaped what we have become, for your father, for your middle name, for continuation of the legacy that you are creating through him." Marcus had repeated the name, Edward James, as though testing the particular sound, as though attempting to integrate the reality that he possessed son named Edward James, that he had created in partnership with Rosalind new human being who would carry forward something of what both of them represented. The remainder of that day had unfolded with remarkable quality of tenderness, with Rosalind recovering from the particular exertion of labor, with the household celebrating the arrival of new heir, with Marcus remaining in close proximity to both mother and child, undertaking the work of bearing witness to what had been created through their partnership. By evening, as Rosalind had rested, and as the infant Edward James had been swaddled and cradled by his father for extended period, something had become evident. Marcus had been granted the extraordinary grace of witnessing his son's arrival, had been spared long enough to greet this new life, and had undertaken the particular work of ensuring that his presence would constitute foundation for the child who was now beginning his own journey through existence. The weeks that had followed the birth of Edward James had unfolded with particular quality of poignancy, had unfolded in manner that seemed to constitute both extraordinary blessing and extraordinary tragedy, existing simultaneously within the same household, within the same chambers, within the same heart space that held both profound joy and profound grief. Marcus's physical condition had begun to deteriorate more rapidly in the wake of the extraordinary effort that witnessing Edward's birth and undertaking initial engagement with his son had required. The particular exertion, brief though it had been, had seemed to accelerate the progression of his illness in manner that Dr. Mercer had articulated with characteristic careful honesty. Marcus now had weeks remaining, rather than months, perhaps only 2 to 4 weeks before his condition would reach terminal stage. Yet rather than this knowledge, seeming to diminish the particular presence that Marcus had established within the household, it had seemed instead to clarify and to intensify it. He had undertaken the work of being present for the earliest days of Edward's life, with conscious intention and with particular recognition that such time was bounded, that such presence was temporary, that the opportunity to be father to his newborn son was gift of particular and limited duration. He had begun a particular ritual. Each morning, when strength permitted, he had arranged to hold his son, to observe the infant's face, to undertake the particular work of being present in manner that he had hoped would constitute memory carried forward into the child's future, even if conscious memory was impossible. He had whispered to the infant, had articulated words that no one else could hear, had engaged in conversation that was one-sided, yet that seemed to constitute profound communication nonetheless. Rosalind had observed these moments with particular kind of sacred recognition, had recognized that what Marcus was undertaking was not merely holding his son, but rather was undertaking the work of loving someone in manner that transcended physical presence, that transcended the particular duration of life, that undertaken conscious knowledge of impending absence and yet undertaken deliberately and with full commitment nonetheless. The household had seemed to recognize collectively that something extraordinary was occurring, that the particular intersection of new life and approaching death had created particular atmosphere of grace and of meaning that transcended ordinary experience. Mrs. Whitmore had undertaken the particular work of ensuring that Marcus had whatever support he required. Ellen had moved through the household with particular gentleness that seemed to articulate her recognition of what was unfolding. The Dowager Duchess had spent extended time in contemplation of her son, had begun to undertake conversations with Rosalind regarding what arrangements would be necessary after Marcus's death, yet had undertaken such practical planning with recognition that it existed alongside the extraordinary grace of the present moment. Dr. Mercer had continued to call, had continued to undertake examinations of both Rosalind and Edward, had undertaken particular assessment of Marcus with regard for both his physical condition and his emotional state. By mid-May, he had undertaken conversation with Rosalind that had been sufficiently direct to suggest that Marcus's time was approaching its conclusion. I would advise that you ensure that anything that remains to be communicated is communicated soon. The particular progression suggests that his condition may reach terminal stage at any time. Yet Marcus himself had demonstrated particular quality of peace regarding what was approaching, had undertaken no particular attempt to resist or to manage the particular reality of his impending death. Instead, he had undertaken the particular work of presence, presence with Rosalind, presence with Edward, presence with the household that had become the context of his final existence. There had been a particular evening late in May, when Rosalind had observed Marcus sitting beside Edward's cradle, had observed him watching the sleeping infant with expression of such profound love and such profound sorrow that she had recognized in his face the particular poignancy of his position. He was father to this child, was responsible for this child, was bound to this child through the particular gift of creation, and yet he was approaching the moment when he would be required to release this child, when he would be required to cease his physical presence in this child's life. She had positioned herself beside him, had undertaken to speak with particular care regarding what she perceived he was experiencing. "You are grieving the future that you will not be present for." "Yes," he had replied simply, and the brevity of his response had communicated the particular depth of what he was experiencing. "I am grieving all the moments that I will not witness. I am grieving all the conversations that I will not be able to have with him. I am grieving that I will not be present to guide him through childhood, through adolescence, through the particular challenges that his life will present. And yet, simultaneously, I am grateful. Grateful that I have been spared long enough to hold him, grateful that I have been granted the extraordinary grace of knowing that he exists, grateful that through you, and through the particular values that we will ensure are transmitted to him, something of what I am will persist in the world after I am gone." He had paused, had continued with voice that had carried particular quality of profound truth. "I believe that authentic presence is not measured by duration. It is measured by the particular quality and the particular depth of the engagement that we undertake. I have been present to this child for these weeks in manner that is complete and that is total. When I am gone, he will not remember these particular moments. His consciousness will not retain these images. Yet something will persist, something of the particular love and the particular commitment that is being communicated through my presence in these weeks will be integrated into his being in manner that transcends what conscious memory would constitute. That is sufficient. That is enough." The final weeks of May had unfolded with particular quality of recognition that the household was occupying sacred time, time in which death was approaching, yet time in which love and presence and creation were simultaneously at their most evident and most powerful. The gardens had reached their fullest flowering. The household had continued its operations. And within the chambers of the Duke and Duchess, a man had continued to love his wife, to greet his son, to undertake the particular work of making meaning out of what would otherwise constitute only loss. By the end of May, as the month had given way toward June, and as Marcus's condition had reached the final stage that Dr. Mercer had anticipated, something had become evident. The particular story that had begun with transaction and obligation, that had transformed through conscious choosing of authenticity and presence, was approaching its conclusion, yet conclusion that would not erase what had been created, but rather would seal it with the particular finality that death represented. The summer of 1873 had arrived with particular quality of warmth and of light that seemed to characterize the period when Edward James Wellington had reached his 10th year of existence, had arrived with the particular knowledge that a decade had passed since the moment when his father had first held him, had first articulated the name Edward James, had first undertaken the particular work of loving a child across the boundary that would soon separate them. The gardens of Ashcroft House had flourished during those 10 years in manner that seemed metaphorically appropriate. What had been carefully planted had grown, had developed, had reached maturity, and had undertaken the work of producing fruit and flowering and continuation. The household had continued its operations under the capable management of Rosalind, who had undertaken the work of being widow and sole parent and steward of her late husband's legacy with the particular grace and the particular strength that she had demonstrated throughout her partnership with Marcus. Edward James had grown into a young person who possessed remarkable qualities, who possessed his father's particular intensity of gaze, who possessed his father's fundamental decency and capacity for genuine presence, and who possessed his mother's particular resilience and particular recognition that authentic engagement with life required willingness to undertake both joy and sorrow without attempt to minimize either. It had been on particular afternoon in July when Edward had approached his mother with question that suggested he had reached the particular age and the particular maturity that would permit him to undertake reading of the letters that his father had written for him across the span of his childhood. Rosalind had been sitting in the library, the same library where she and Marcus had undertaken so many conversations, where they had articulated their growing understanding of one another, where they had moved from transaction to genuine partnership, and Edward had positioned himself before her with the particular formality that suggested he was requesting something he recognized to be significant. "Mother," he had articulated, his voice carrying the particular quality of approaching adolescence, "I wish to read the letters that father wrote for me. I believe I have reached the age where I am capable of understanding what he wished to communicate." Rosalind had observed her son with the particular recognition that this moment had been approaching for years, that she had been preparing for the moment when Edward would be ready to know his father through the particular legacy of written word that Marcus had created. She had risen from her chair, had moved toward the particular cabinet where the letters had been carefully preserved, and had undertaken the work of retrieving them. "Your father," she had articulated, "wrote these letters across the final months of his life. He wrote them for you, not for the child that you were at the time of his death, but for the child that you would become, for the young man that you are becoming, for the person that you will be as you move through life. These letters constitute his voice speaking across time, constitute his particular love and his particular wisdom reaching toward you across the span of his absence." She had placed the letters into Edward's hands, and she had perceived that he was recognizing the particular weight of what he was holding, was recognizing that these particular documents represented his father's presence in material form, represented the particular gift that Marcus had created through the work of articulation and through the work of presence in those final months. Edward had undertaken to read the first letter that very evening, had positioned himself in the library with the particular solemnity that such reading required. The letter was brief, was addressed to the newborn child, to the person that Edward had been in the immediate aftermath of his birth, and articulated Marcus's particular joy in witnessing his son's arrival, his particular sorrow regarding what his absence would mean, his particular hope that despite his physical absence, something of what he was would persist through the child who carried his name and who carried his blood. What had followed during the subsequent weeks and months was the particular process through which Edward had undertaken to read the remaining letters, had read letters that had been written for his 5th birthday, his 10th birthday, letters that had been written for the moment when he would reach adolescence and would begin to undertake the particular work of understanding himself and his place in the world. Each letter had articulated something different, something that seemed designed to address the particular challenges and the particular recognitions that Edward would encounter at each stage of his development. The final letter, The letter written for Edward's 18th year, for the moment when he would undertake the transition to adulthood, had contained particular articulation that seemed to constitute the culmination of all that Marcus had wished to communicate. In that letter, he had articulated his understanding that authentic love could transcend mortality, that presence could persist beyond physical existence, that what mattered was not the duration of life, but rather the quality and the consciousness with which life was undertaken. "You are the evidence," Marcus had written in that final letter, "of what authentic love can accomplish. You are living manifestation of your mother's willingness to commit to genuine partnership, despite limitation, of my willingness to love, despite knowing that such love would be bounded by mortality, of both of us choosing to create meaning and to undertake creation of new life despite the particular fear and the particular uncertainty that such creation required. You are not merely our biological son. You are testimony to what authentic partnership can generate. You are living answer to the question of whether love can transcend limitation and whether presence can persist beyond physical duration. The answer is yes. You are that answer. You are that possibility made manifest." On the evening when Edward had completed the final letter, he had positioned himself across from his mother in the library, in the same space where she and Marcus had undertaken so many conversations, and had articulated with particular clarity what he was recognizing. "Father is not absent. He has been present throughout my entire existence. Through these letters, through the values that you have embodied, through the particular legacy that his love created, he has been teaching me, has been guiding me, has been loving me. His physical death was not cessation. It was transformation. It was continuation through a different medium." Rosalind had found herself unable to articulate response, had found herself moved beyond words by the particular recognition that her son had achieved, by the particular understanding that he had integrated regarding what his father had accomplished through the work of conscious presence and conscious commitment, despite the boundary of mortality. "Yes," she had responded finally, her voice carrying the particular emotion that such recognition generated. "Your father understood that authentic love does not require infinite time. It requires only consciousness, commitment, presence. He undertook the work of loving you with complete dedication, despite knowing that he would not be present for the majority of your life. And that love, that conscious, committed, complete love, has persisted. It persists in you. It persists in the values that you carry. It persists in your capacity for genuine presence and genuine connection. It persists in everything that you are becoming." The summer of 1873 had continued to unfold with the particular quality of completion and of continuation existing simultaneously, had continued with the recognition that the particular marriage that had begun as transaction, that had transformed through conscious choosing into authentic partnership, that had produced extraordinary child, had not ended with Marcus's death, but rather had been sealed and preserved and transformed into legacy that would persist into the future through the child who carried forward something of what both his parents represented. Edward James Wellington, who would himself grow into man capable of profound presence and authentic connection, would spend his lifetime honoring the particular legacy that his father had created, would spend his lifetime embodying the particular understanding that authentic love transcends temporal limitation, that conscious presence persists beyond physical duration, that what matters is not the quantity of time, but rather the quality of engagement that life permits. The particular story of Rosalind and Marcus, Duke of Ashcroft, did not end with his death. It persisted, transformed, embodied, carried forward into the life of the child they had created together, into the household that continued to operate according to the principles they had established, into the very soul of Ashcroft House itself, where genuine partnership and authentic presence had been demonstrated as possible, even within the boundaries of mortality and limitation. Thank you for spending these hours with Rosalind and Marcus, for witnessing their extraordinary journey from transaction to authentic love, from fear to presence, from mortality to legacy. This is Victorian Romance, audio stories, and we are grateful for your presence as we shared this tale of how genuine partnership can transcend even the boundary of death itself. If Edward's discovery of his father's letters moved you, if Rosalind's courage in choosing authentic presence over protective distance resonated with you, we ask that you join our community. Subscribe to our channel so that you receive notification of new stories as they arrive. We would be honored to hear from you. What was the moment that most touched your heart? What do you believe Edward learned from his father's letters? What would you have written in those letters had you been Marcus, knowing your time was limited? Your comments shape the stories we create, and your perspective matters profoundly to us. Please share this story with those in your life who believe that authentic love, the kind that persists beyond limitation, that chooses presence despite mortality, that commits despite uncertainty, is worth creating. They deserve to know that such love is possible, that it is beautiful, and that it creates legacy that extends far into the future. We are grateful. We are honored. We will see you in the next story.